One eye snapped wide with sudden, earth-shattering realization, staring straight ahead, like a wordless confession forming in the silence. On his knees, he clutched his head, stunned out of his mind. No way, reincarnation. The moment that thought hit, another question rose up below. What's your favorite game? He fired back in his head. I'll answer like this. Then boom, images of a shining sword, a mystical orb, and an ancient tome slammed into his vision. The dungeon brave soul world bursts open. And there they are. Cheery blonde kid, calm woman in traditional clothes, and a bright-eyed girl, standing together before a fancy, ornate building beneath a perfect, clear sky. This was the big, jaw-dropping start. The moment he swore he'd been reincarnated straight into my favorite game's world, with magic, a whole fantasy setup, and a harem waiting around the corner. Right there, a fresh crew took position before an epic academy, including a striking blonde girl and a dark-haired young man who looked way too much like the protagonist. Back in his own reality, the man now in a suit slumped into his apartment and let out a heavy sigh, wiped out. Just few more, he muttered, the exhaustion of the whole day hanging off his shoulders. He slid into his seat in a flash, fingers twitching over the mouse. Sorry to make you wait. From now on, it's my turn, he declared, and that tired slump got wiped out by pure electric anticipation. Headphones on, controller in hand, he dove headfirst into Dungeon Brave Soul Asterisk, fully swallowed by the game's world. Cozy in his room, totally different from that earlier exhaustion. Inside the game, the Grand Academy was buzzing like it knew something huge was coming. Slayer Year 101, April 5th, entrance ceremony day, and a whole new chapter was seconds from exploding into life for its students. Students clustered together, trading greetings and jittery whispers about the entrance ceremony and the exam results. Good morning, you nervous about the entrance ceremony too? One asked, while another fretted over their exam scores. The narrator popped in to explain it was a sword and magic fantasy RPG, and the gamer practically lit up. Yes. And with a grin, he blurted, all right, entering the 42nd round. He took a refreshing gulp, and you could feel it. His love for the game wasn't just there, it was driving him. I play it again and again, and I still never get bored. He admitted that his non-stop dedication to Dungeon Brave Soul was the only thing that kept him standing when his workplace crushed his spirit, like that bleak office shot, where he was stuck grinding through the same dull day. He pictured himself dropped into Dungeon Brave Soul Asterisk, where Leon Price, the game's top male student, is suddenly surrounded by a swarm of female students all fighting for his attention. And he realizes the whole hook is the way the game lets you build deep bonds with the heroines, right up to the romance. In this crazy game world, a teacher stood in front of the class, ready to blast out the entrance exam rankings, while Leon Prez and the likes of Nagisa Sekai, Aith Centria, Shell Uranus, plus that serious-looking guy in the corner, held their breath and waited for the results to drop. Back in his own reality, the protagonist had his headphones on, a drink clutched in hand, and a huge grin on his face, totally lost in the game, just waiting for the next mind-blowing twist in its tangled world. He kept playing in the cozy bubble of his room, and as the game pulled him in, it finally introduced the four main characters that would drive the whole story. Then it breaks down two of the big names, Shell Uranus, who scored 5th on the entrance exam and kicked things off as a mage, and Nagisa Sekai, who grabbed 4th place and started his journey as a swordsman. Trailing right behind them was Aith Centria. She'd snagged 3rd place in the entrance exam and set off as a cleric, her soft smile glowing like it had no idea what brutal trials were coming. Then the game finally throws Leon Price into the spotlight, untouchable class topper from the entrance exam, tagged as a spellblade, and the twist hits hard. He's a hero's descendant, the kind of true protagonist the story has been waiting for. He finally got it. The whole story was about taking control of Leon, getting closer and closer to every heroine, and then throwing down with the terrifying Demon King, and the game didn't stop there. It was packed with tons of big side quests and tiny secrets, some everybody talks about, others still just rumors, all stacking together to make the experience feel insanely deep. As the story heated up, the visuals didn't just look good. They evolved with it. The heroine's outfit graphics shifted with every turn, showing off jaw-dropping artistry, and he realized that this stunning visual punch, along with one more big factor, was what drove Dungeon Brave Soul's sales through the roof. He nailed it on the head. That game blew up because it was built for adults, so Leon could finally trade in deeper, more suggestive moments with the heroines. He couldn't look away from the game's promise. Build a harem, grow it your way. And the thought alone made his face burn as he pictured himself with Leon Prey and heroines like Aith Centria. The game practically dared you to max out your bond with the heroines, and yeah, Those intimacy moments hit your heart like a love song. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the magic wasn't quite as deep as it looked, especially with Leon drowning in gorgeous women like Shell Uranus, Nagisa Sekai, and the rest. The game Dambori exploded in popularity, and before anyone could blink, it was getting anime and manga adaptations plus a mountain of merchandise, everywhere you looked. Because it nailed the perfect mix of gritty RPG battles and teasing, more erotic moments, which blew players away and helped fuel its adulterated fame. The game looked irresistible, but he still groaned in frustration and rubbed his temple, because he knew it had everything he'd ever want, even if he hadn't cracked every corner yet. He kept cradling his head in his hands, fighting through a wave of exhaustion, while the game characters, Fantasy Male 2 and the two female students, kept on talking on screen like nothing was wrong. Finally, the exhaustion crushed him, and he sank down to the floor beside his gaming setup, sprawled among the leftovers of his marathon session. A lone figure in dark, billowing clothes stands in a grand hall, staring like it's a dare. Then the question hits hard. What game do you hate? This question opens the door to Dungeon Brave Soul 2 ***, where Xenon, who in the first story didn't even get a name, steps into the spotlight as the main hero, and we watch him team up with Leon Wright as the tale picks up after Leon seals the Demon King. In this second game, you step into Xenon's boots and blaze through a world now shackled by brutal chains. Then the story flips on you and goes somewhere you didn't see coming. Xenon starts by circling Leon, then somehow clicks with him fast, too fast, turning it into a total troublemaker friendship. And at the same time, he worms his way into the heroines' lives, recruiting them one by one until they're standing together as a force to be reckoned with. As time drags on, the group's vibe flips in a hurry. The heroines who were once glued to Leon start slipping away, one by one. This unsettling turn hit because Xenon was quietly snatching the heroines one by one, and as he sat there, smug and triumphant on their pile, his dominance was on full display. Cornered and powerless, Leon is forced to watch Xenon's cruelty up close. He drags out the heroine he's taken and torments her right in front of Leon. The heroine's face twists in pure agony and terror as she lets out a desperate scream, begging the torment to stop, right now. Leon's own face is carved with pure despair, tears spilling as he reaches out with a trembling hand, utterly helpless to stop what's happening. Clinging to the edge of total despair as the horror crashes down, Leon snaps. He breaks the ancient seal of the Demon King, then turns his back on hope and strides into a shadowy, cursed cave, hunting a way out using forbidden power. A blinding burst of light tore through everything, screaming that the world had just hit its final end, because the Demon King's unleashed power was the trigger. The protagonist snapped back to the game that carved this ruin. Dungeon Brave Soul 2 ***, a twisted love and battle nightmare, where Leon, the original hero, got brutalized by Xenon, the new guy who ripped away Leon's heroines, and all he could think was how much he despised it, like he'd never want to live through that horror again. He reached out with trembling fingers, and this eerie, brand-new feeling crawled over him as he finally started to wake up. Then he took in his surroundings, this insanely lavish room, and felt it. A body leaner, stronger, way more muscular than anything he remembered, and suddenly he couldn't stop asking where he was and why his physique had flipped so hard. Even with the chaos swirling in his head, he still clocked the room's stunning wealth. The luxury was impossible to miss. He strode up to the massive, gold-trimmed mirror, eyes locked on the reflection that was about to meet him. As he closed in, his reflection started to glitch and take shape, until it revealed a face that wasn't his at all. He froze and stared at the strange face, eyes bulging with pure shock. Because it wasn't his reflection at all, it was a total stranger staring back. His thoughts spun out of control the second he spotted that face in the mirror. Xenon Baskerville, the one villain from Dambor he hated more than anyone. And then horror ripped through him as he screamed, clutching his head. The shock hit like a wrecking ball. He dropped to his knees, despair flooding every thought. He'd been reincarnated, not as his beloved protagonist, but as the villain he despised in his favorite game. And right then, the nightmare of his new life, Xenon Baskerville, finally kicked off. He jolted awake, heart pounding, and there it was. The face staring back belonged to Xenon Baskerville, the one guy he couldn't stand. This was Dungeon Brave's Soul World now, and somehow the former player had been thrown into the protagonist role of Dembare, the story he loved more than anything. He stared at the cruel twist of fate that dumped him into this life, and the weight of it hit him hard. So he grabbed for a few more precious seconds of sleep, face-planting onto the floor right beside a low table packed with gaming gear, like his old life was staring back at him. He racked his brain for what kind of evil you'd have to pull in a past life to get reborn as the man people whisper about, one who hunts women. Because that reputation seemed to show up before Xenon even did, with 2 female students clinging to him like a memory that wouldn't let go. If Reincarnation was really written for him, he'd have begged for Leon's role, the real protagonist, since Leon was always surrounded by fangirling female students, while Xenon's name carried nothing but a shady reputation. Right when he was deep in his thoughts, the door burst open and a maid slipped into his room without permission. He nearly jumped out of his skin. Then she started blurting apologies nonstop for barging in. The maid kept spilling her regret, saying he never even stirred when she knocked, so she panicked and slipped inside without waiting. Then she bowed so low she looked ready to take any punishment for being rude and looking a mess. He snapped in a gasp of pure shock and confusion, staring as the maid stayed locked in that deep bow, like she fully expected punishment to come down. She kept insisting she was ready, begging him to punish her the way he always did, while he flinched inside, stuck on what as usual even meant, and whether the Xenon he started with really had been committing daily violence, whipping her included. He snapped at her to slip her clothes back on right now, seething at Xenon's nasty side and praying his silence wouldn't make him look guilty. Then the maid blinked, promised she'd do it, and warned that if this was really normal, he'd end up barking that order at her at least 10 times, and he swore, straight up, that he wouldn't lay a hand on her just for getting dressed. A moment later, the maid, fully dressed now, thanked him for waiting, and he lifted up a set of dark clothes to confirm they were Xenon's, no doubt about it. He stared at the maid a little longer and realized she was stunning. He couldn't believe a woman like that got shoved into some background slot in the game. Then he snapped back to the moment and asked her what the date was today. With one finger pressed softly to her lips, the maid told him, clear as day, that it was April 5th, 101 in the Slayer calendar, and that locked the truth in his head. He was absolutely in the world of Dambor. He couldn't stop replaying what April 5th meant, the day the Royal Academy of Sword and Magic opened its doors in the royal capital, a moment burned into everyone's memory, and for him. Since he'd already finished the game, that date hit even harder, like it was stamped into his bones. While he plotted his next move, Zenon-sama's main inquirer straight-up decided to skip morning training today, and he promised from this very day on he'd start going to the academy. Demate couldn't believe it. Xenon always kicked off his training every single morning, no excuses. While the protagonist gripped his hand and spun up a dark energy vortex, realizing the real Xenon had a relentless, hardworking heart and powers that were never shown in Dambor 2. The maid offered to whip up breakfast if he was done training for a bit, but he shut it down. He told her he'd keep going like always and demanded she guide him straight to the training grounds. Chasing the maid through the halls, he clocked every detail. This place was straight out of the game, and he couldn't shake the question. What kind of training ground was Xenon really running here? He picked up a sword and started training, and his body began locking in with Xenon's physical abilities, like he'd been swinging in this exact form since birth. He studied the training targets and realized Xenon's martial arts weren't just talent. They were on a whole other level, so he locked in his focus and slashed forward with a brutal dark blade strike. The dark blade slammed into its target with brutal force, exploding it into a storm of shattered fragments. He kept digging into Xenon's past, wondering how a guy so disciplined ended up as the villain who steals other men's women, then clocked the brutal skill of the dark magic Xenon mastered, meaning the real Xenon must have drilled swordsmanship and spellwork for years. And if he was stuck in this body, he was determined to learn every last thing about Xenon. A jolt hit him. Xenon's terrible reputation wasn't mystery at all. It was womanizing. But right then, he hadn't stolen a single woman, and today was the Royal Academy's entrance ceremony. So he told himself, easy, no hate yet. Once he finally caught up with what came next, he swore that since he'd become Xenon, he'd dodge the messy scandal that wrecked the character in the game's sequel. No more chaos for him. He pictured an easy school life, wondering if he'd back the protagonist in the fight to take down the Demon King, or if he'd just stay out of danger altogether. Right then, a maid glided up with a glass of water, and he took it with a grateful smile, like it was exactly what he needed. Meanwhile, Leviana the maid inched around the corner, eyes blazing wide as she caught sight of that shocking, unexpected exchange. He spun toward her shirtless and demanded why she'd gone still, and Leviana, shaken to the core, couldn't believe Xenon-sama was really thanking her. She berated herself, cursed him for stirring up emotions like this, and forced her face back into calm. He locked eyes with her and blurted out his real gratitude, swearing that his heart had been too shy to say it before now. Leviana's cheeks flared red, and all she could squeeze out was a tiny, stunned gasp. Tears spilled as she clapped both hands over her mouth, stunned to the core, while he tightened his resolve, vowing he'd never turn into a villain like the original Xenon, because changing his heart and his choices was the only chance he had left. Leviana burst into tears of pure joy, calling it the best day of her life, and saying her devotion had finally been repaid. Then he slid his hands into hers, admitted it was his fault for not thanking her sooner, and swore he'd appreciate her for real from that moment on. Still shaking with tears, she nodded and vowed her loyalty to her young master would never, ever waver. Xenon, now in his school uniform, geared up to ride off in a grand carriage, while Leviana, eyes still glassy with emotion, bit back a tender farewell and begged him to take care. Xenon even noticed how easy it was to pull that reaction out of her, and he reminded himself to stay sharp so he wouldn't turn into the kind of villain who'd exploit devotion. An elderly butler watched the whole moment unfold. As the carriage lurched into motion, Leviana kept waving like her life depended on it, screaming that her young master must come back safe. No injuries. Beside her, the butler stayed cool as a stone, while Xenon peered out the window with a calm, unshaken look. He let out a tired sigh, stuck in his head like a burning question. How much of the original game's story was he really going to let play out? From this day on, the entrance ceremony kicks off everything in Dambor for real. Leon Brave is set to spend the next 2 years at the academy, training and teaming up with the heroines to take down the Demon King. As he weighed what it meant to be just another classmate, he started asking himself how deep he was really meant to dive into the main story. Then he swore it. No way would the heroine get betrayed, no way would he steal someone else's girlfriend, because in his world, love had to stay clean and true. His mind drifted straight into the darker sequel, **Dambore 2**, where Leon, the hero who sealed the Demon King, gets betrayed by Xenon**, who snatches the heroine away, plunging him into despair and driving him to resurrect the Demon King **. When the Demon King is brought back to life, the unleashed magic will go on a citywide rampage, crushing the royal capital and everyone inside, sealing a truly catastrophic bad ending. He realized that if he just stopped snatching women, he could dodge the tragedy, and he decided to wait while Leon fought the Demon King, straight up ignoring the game's scripted fate for his character. With a fierce stare, he swore he'd never follow Xenon's old route. He'd carve out a new destiny, one that breaks away from the game's script. A massive, ornate gate, etched with the words *Royal Academy of Sword and Magic **, stood wide open, inviting a whole group of students in, while they huddled at the entrance, dwarfed by the towering walls, hyped to kick off their first day of destiny. Fists clenched and a grin gone almost wild across his face, he roared that this was the academy, the place where brave souls get forged, and he'd been waiting forever because now the moment was finally here. Let's go. The academy sprawled out like a legend, huge domes, jaw-dropping facades, and sunlight blazing over everything, while students swarmed the grounds, turning every courtyard and grand staircase into a non-stop storm of youthful energy. As he strode through the school like he owned every inch of it, an unwelcome wave of nerves crashed into him. Then he snapped at himself for feeling so pathetic, especially when it was him. He forced himself to calm down, feeling his energy dip as the initial rush faded. But that peace lasted no time, because the second Leon, the hero of this world, came into view, his eyes snapped wide and a sharp breath ripped out of him. He studied the whole scene, a sneaky grin tugging at his lips as the game's plot came back to him. First the entrance ceremony in the auditorium, then a class orientation. And after that the girls would drag Leon into a social gathering where he'd finally get up close with the heroines, until a sudden, explosive outburst tore through his thoughts, and he blurted out a warning that everyone shouldn't be terrified, even as his own face contorted into pure, frantic desperation. His face twisted into a terrifying grin, eyes bulging with dilated pupils, and right beside him the 2 female students jolted back in horror. Hands clapped over their mouths as shock hit. He didn't even notice, totally locked in on his own thoughts. The 2 girls, still rattled, finally admitted the whole mess wasn't on them. It was his fault, all the way. Meanwhile, he stormed off with his back turned, staring at the truth like it hit him. From now on, he'd have to watch his step and stop trying not to lose it, and laugh so hard around strangers. He suddenly found himself stranded in that giant auditorium, hemmed in by nothing but rows of empty seats, and it hit him hard how alone he really was. Then he slapped his hand over his face, let out a heavy sigh, and stared at his place in the story. Xenon Baskerville, the brutal villain and the so-called cuckold, and even with nobody around, he still insisted, "I'm not lonely." He leaned in, eyes sharp, as the old butler stood before the students and announced he was about to name the winners of the entrance exam. Then the butler declared the fifth-place winner, Uranus. A young woman with a radiant smile and a feather in her hair beamed with pride as her hard-earned win was recognized. She was the frontier noble's daughter, a straight-up offensive magic mage, and the childhood friend who pushed Leon, the main character, to finally join the academy. Next, the butler called out the fourth-place winner, Nagisa Seika, and the moment her name hit the air, she blushed hard, heart pounding like it wanted to break free. She came from a Japanese-style country and grew up in a swordsman's dojo as the daughter of its master, raised to be a true samurai, ready to cut down anyone in her path. First, she fought like a speed demon, so deadly she made Leon look slow, and the protagonist watched her closely, clocking that heavy darkness in her heart, the exact fuel he'd need for what came next in his conquest. Then the butler snapped. Third place goes to Aith Centria. A beauty with roots in central nobility, her father a cardinal, and her life forged inside the church as a cleric. And when she smiled with confidence, staff in hand, the protagonist couldn't help but notice how strikingly put together she was. Then the butler ripped the next name from the air, Aith's Academy runner-up, the second-place winner, Zenon Baskerville, and Zenon shot a smug grin because the future where Aith was crushed, taken down both in body and spirit by him, was gone for good. He kept blushing like crazy, hating the fact that every main heroine was adorable. Yet the worst part was he felt pulled toward them, stuck as the villain with no clue what he was supposed to do. The butler couldn't wait anymore. He snapped Zenon Baskerville's name into the air, his voice razor-sharp with anticipation. Zenon jolted, groaned, and realized he'd blown his shot to rise, while the other students in the auditorium drew their stares like a line of fire. He stayed planted in his seat, panic hammering his thoughts as he clocked the unwanted buzz his second-place finish had sparked. Whispers already slinging around campus about the infamous basketball family, their rumored links to a criminal guild, and even the shadow of the previous king, while the headmaster, an elegant old man with presence, stepped up to the front and warned everyone. Royal Sword and Magic Academy students, noble or common, are equal, and any disrespect would get shut down fast. Then it hit him with a jolt. He'd missed his cue to stand up, and now his awkwardness was only getting worse, while the headmaster stared at him like he'd seen everything. Even with his nerves screaming inside, he forced himself to stay seated, because one wrong move might get him picked on. Then he shot out a sarcastic apology for his rudeness, promised he'd follow the headmaster's advice, and wore this low-key, villain-level smirk like he meant it. A suffocating silence crashes over the whole assembly hall, and the tension is so thick you could slice it, every single eye locked on that defiant student. Meanwhile, the heroines, Uranus, Nagisa Sekai, and Aith Centria, can't take their eyes off the chaos unfolding in front of them. The headmaster, eyes like stone, accepted Zenon's apology, then called out the cheeky way he said it, glaring like, "So you're really not planning to fix that rebellious attitude?" Zenon was freaking out inside, swearing he'd already apologized, and insisting that even with that villain look, he was secretly a good guy. The headmaster let out a small cough, then declared, "Since this is a celebration, you get to rest your heads for now." But he immediately snapped with a harsh warning. If things don't improve next time, he couldn't promise what would happen. Zenon blurted out a shocked gasp. Still stunned by the reprimand and his messed-up timing, he kept replaying it in his head. What did he even do wrong? Then the headmaster snapped the spotlight onto someone else, announcing Leon Bray as the first-place achiever and class president. Leon Brave, born as a hero's child, was the only one who could seal the Demon King, the real, one-and-only protagonist with destiny in his hands. Even as a commoner, he crushed school, ranked one in his class, had heroines falling for him, and rocked that handsome blonde look. And his first gig, a rune knight, rare as gold, blending brutal close-range fighting with magic, a power so uncommon the game's lore only mentions two of them. He locked eyes with Zenon, and Zenon instantly wondered if that look was pure hatred, because he hadn't stolen any heroines, not yet. But then it hit him. The real protagonist from the game he'd played 100 times was standing right in front of him. Moments later, the headmaster called Leon up to deliver the new student rep's greeting, and Leon nodded, stepped to the front, and spoke to the whole assembly with steady confidence. As Leon stepped up to speak, he threw himself into humility, saying he'd come from the countryside as a plain commoner, and feeling wildly honored to stand before the Royal Sword and Magic Academy. He thanked the faculty, the mentors he hadn't met yet, and most of all, his guardians and Count Uranus, the people who'd truly carried him this far. Meanwhile, Zenon couldn't shake the worry that his earlier outburst might have offended Leon, even if he insisted it was completely accidental. He went on and said the real reason he came to the academy was to forge himself into something stronger, strong enough to protect the nation. He even admitted the Slayer Kingdom was living in peace, but he snapped that peace didn't mean evil was gone, because evil still had to be hunted. Zenon, hanging on every word, couldn't help feeling let down. He'd expected a way bigger Hero King kind of speech. Leon slammed his fist together with a clenched, determined roar, finishing his declaration, and right away the whole group of students erupted into murmurs, while Zenon, blindsided, choked out a shocked ah. A thick wave of silence hit, and Leon's eyes narrowed like a razor, locked on something with pure, deadly focus. Leon's blazing stare snapped straight onto Zenon, and Zenon jerked back in sheer shock, like, "Why are you aiming at me already? I haven't done anything evil yet." But that fear hit hard anyway. Zenon replayed Dambor 3 in his head and realized he was stuck as some minor nobody, then remembered how the hero of Dambor 2, an LJ, suddenly got flipped into a villain protagonist with a brand new backstory, and he couldn't help but wonder if that violent shakeup was why Leon started snapping at him, even though he hadn't done anything at all. He kept chewing on his thoughts, terrified that if Leon finally got crushed by the Demon King, the whole world would spiral into total annihilation. He realized there was zero promise Leon would ever beat the Demon King like they planned, and that a happily ever after might not be in the cards at all. The school ceremony wrapped up, and everyone got sent scrambling to their classrooms, while Zenon sat there, deep in thought, watching the whole classroom buzz around him. He realized that if the whole situation had truly shifted, the game's tricks in his head might not save him anymore. So that soft, passive, just survive plan got tossed aside, and he knew he'd have to go all in. He decided to stay out of Leon's way and fight for the calm, peaceful school life he desperately wanted. Leon, sitting nearby, let out a frustrated grunt as he kept thinking, convinced Zenon's mere presence meant he'd somehow messed up, while Zenon wondered. Maybe there was a smarter, more reliable way to reach his goals. He dreamed about the day he'd finally team up with Leon and the others, throwing his weight behind them after they crushed the Demon King. Because once that nightmare was over, he truly believed they'd de-lock in a safe school life and stop the whole world from ending. And he didn't mince words about his confidence either. In his mind, he was the strongest character standing right after Leon and the Demon King's defeat. A female teacher watched Zenon closely, convinced she could keep him wholesome and on track with the main scenario, no matter what he'd just done, while Zenon, totally baffled, kept asking himself why he'd gone and done it in the first place. When the school day finally wrapped up, the halls buzzed with talk about clubs. Leon even asked how he could join, while everyone else urged him to show up at the next meeting, and Zenon watched it all like it was a live test, thinking that humans decide what they like and don't like in just a few seconds. And with his marquee family name, his face was already famous all across the kingdom. He sprinted back home on instinct, ready to cook up a brand new plan for whatever was coming next, because life had just thrown him curveballs he never saw coming. As soon as he arrived, a grand carriage rolled up to the towering Baskerville mansion, and the moment he stepped out, voices rang out, welcoming the young master back home. Moments later, Leviana the maid burst in at his side, fretting over where he'd been in that biting cold, then snapped the news. His lord father was waiting, and he wanted him in the office right now. The moment Grandolph Baskerville and his father were brought up, a wave of dread flashed across his face, and his expression snapped tight. Grandolph Baskerville was Zenon's father, and the Nightmare King who ruled the night, the same man who shoved Zenon onto the road to evil. He ran the underworld without challengers, bossed a massive crime guild, seized profits at any cost by trafficking slaves, and wielded assassins like tools, burying every truth and threat in pure darkness. So even the game's lore screams just how unmatched his villainy really was. Even though he desperately wanted to stay out of it, he knew his father couldn't be dodged. So with a heavy sigh and a grim nod to the trouble ahead, he marched into the office and announced himself the moment he walked in. He burst in, and boom, dark magic chains tore up from the floor, whipping around him with brutal force. That attack was called Bloody Chain, and it hit fast, savage, and merciless. Those brutal chains snapped tight and pinned him down fast, leaving him sprawled on the ground, completely helpless. He strained against the magical bonds, choking on pain as a shadowy figure hovered over him, its voice icy and eerily familiar, calling out, "Fossum tempo meu filio," and locking in his identity. Grandolph Baskerville loomed over his fatherly son, laying it all out. That cruel dark magic and the bloody chain didn't just hurt. It dragged out the suffering, squeezing restrained torture into slow, intermittent damage for as long as it lasted. Then he casually asked how Zenon did in the entrance exam, smirking that he'd placed second. He kept ripping into Zenon, seething that his son couldn't even claw his way to the top rank in a minor academy, and swore the Baskerville name. Born from Night's strongest dominators, would never bend or lose, calling Xenon a fool who traded away their pride. Meanwhile, Xenon was chained up and squirming in brutal agony, barely able to breathe, let alone speak. Still seething, he told Xenon straight up, "If you don't grab the top spot on the next exam, this punishment is only the opening act, and it won't stop here." Then he pressed Xenon to obey the stewards to the letter and keep training every day before he went off to handle his own work. Seconds after Grandolph stormed out, Leviana burst into the room, eyes bulging in pure terror. Xenon lay there, badly injured, still shackled by a filthy blood-stained chain. She screamed his name, fought back tears, and vowed she'd get him medical help right now. Leviana shoved a powerful healing potion into Xenon's mouth as he lay there, bleeding out and barely awake, his body wrecked by that brutal attack. Later on, Xenon jolted awake in his bed, staring out at the massive Baskerville mansion glowing under the night sky, and he let out a breath of relief as the brutal damage to his body faded fast, proving that potion was the real deal. Then he spotted Leviana asleep beside him, her head tucked on the bed, utterly drained from all the work she'd done to take care of him. Xenon stared at Leviana's kindness like it didn't make sense, because why would someone so pure ever choose a monster like him, a depraved bastard who steals other people's lovers? And every time the thought hit, his mind slammed back into the old scars. The abuse and torture his father inflicted, pain that still burned every time he dared to remember. Then his mind snapped straight to Grandolph Baskerville, and he blamed him with zero doubt for how Xenon spiraled into madness in the first place, certain it was Grandolph's cruelty that shattered Xenon's sanity. He finally saw the truth. Xenon's mental meltdown wasn't random. It was the daily abuse crushing him, one burden at a time, until his mind snapped, and then he brutally framed Leon and grabbed the heroine. Xenon just kept spiraling over why Leon made his blood boil, everything Xenon didn't have. The heroines' love, his classmates' praise, and even adults cheering after they finally took down the Demon King. Xenon was born into a notorious family, got crushed and hated by the other students, got shoved through abuse, and never felt a father's warmth. So Leon became that maddening, living reminder of everything he wanted and everything he could never have. He kept replaying Xenon's ancient past in his head, reliving how he stole every heroine away from Leon, where Aith Centria was spotted in tears, crushed by the original Xenon's selfish hunger. With that hard glint in his eyes, he clenched his fist and sealed his decision like it was fate. Then he set a brand new, rock-solid goal for himself in this world. Then his mind snapped to that shadowy, monstrous figure, someone he felt he had to beat, even before the Demon King ever entered the fight. That creepy, smug smile belonged to Grandolph, Xenon's father, and Xenon snapped, calling him a forever enemy that had no right to exist, locking in his plan to wipe him out. He swore he'd smash the script fate wrote and defy the evil leader's father, because after being reborn, he'd live on his own rules, free at last, and savor this world without anyone steering him. Right when Leviana's resolve started to steel, the maid burst into his room, startling him awake as she gasped, cheeks flushed with surprise and pure relief, and called out to him. She lunged into him right away, clung to him tight, buried her face in his chest, and whispered his name like a secret, while he froze, flustered by how fiercely she was holding on. Leviana blurted out his name in shock, still clinging to him like she couldn't believe it, while he stood there rattled and flustered. Then the world swung to a breathtaking view, Baskerville's massive, intimidating estate stretched out beneath a sky full of stars. Later, Xenon sat alone at a tiny table in a lavish room, scribbling furiously in his notebook while his brow knotted tight with pure concentration. He had to quickly verify everything he already knew about this world, scratching down every quest and location in his notebook, then locking it in so he could charge into the road ahead. He painstakingly wrote down everything he knew, laying out how the whole situation would unfold, and the key facts he had to grab. Then he chose to write it all in Japanese so he could understand it fast and pull it up anytime. With his first notes finally done, he stared ahead and asked himself how to live for real in this world, and a rush of pride hit him hard. His plans felt solid, like he was ready for what came next. He knew the only way to reach his dream was to take down his own father, Randolph, and that creepy smirk just kept haunting him, daring him with every thought like the final boss was already standing in his way. As he kept plotting, he couldn't shake the thought. If he veered off the set plan, Leon's moves would turn wild and screw everything up. He even toyed with the idea of just leaving the house, then tossed it aside fast, because the streets were crawling with gangsters and assassins, and running wasn't an escape at all. His face snapped into cold focus the moment he faced the truth. If Leon, the hero, ever got defeated by the Demon King, the whole world would die. He wished, desperately, that the Demon King could be sealed away, but the fate of everything crushed down on him like a mountain. He stared straight at how his world truly worked. Leon, the destined hero, ringed by heroines who clicked into place so tightly their bonds felt unbreakable. Then it hit him. Leon was the magnet pulling everyone in, while the MC's fate was to get left behind, choking back tears, staring at the emptiness where everyone else belonged. Lying in bed, the protagonist stared at the ceiling, realizing he couldn't just coast anymore. If he wanted to get stronger, he'd have to learn fresh skills and sharpen the ones he already had. Then he tapped his status screen. Bam! A hologram snapped into existence, flashing that he was Xenon Baskerville, a magic swordsman, and that his swordsmanship was sitting at a clean 20. He clocked that his real-life job matched his in-game role to a T, magic swordsman, just like Leon. And he realized this world didn't run on normal levels at all. You got stronger by grinding your skill proficiency. As he dug deeper, he stared at his stats. Swordsmanship at 20, dark magic at 20, and even training at 20, and he muttered, totally stunned, like, what the heck is going on here? He finally got why sword skills and dark magic demanded the same kind of mastery, but the sudden jump in his training still left him scratching his head. He just prayed he wouldn't have to lean on dark magic, because he couldn't wrap his mind around how its proficiency rose so fast. He immediately clocked that this status screen wasn't like the game at all. It didn't show item controls, settings, or even save and load options, like he'd been dropped into a harsher reality with fewer ways to mess with the world. He figured he had to grab the right items and grind new skills to get stronger, and he noticed combat skills were still sitting at 0, meaning the real growth was massive. Then it hit him. Push certain skills up to a set level, and that's what opens the door to level up from his starting class into the next one. Then it hit him, gear mattered, and strong weapons and armor could jack up his abilities, while the right items would unlock brand new skills and magic. Plus he had his eyes on accessories and damage-cutting talismans he was determined to get his hands on. Then he started weighing every way to get those life-or-death items, buy them in stores, risk his neck in savage dungeons, or snag them as rewards after taking down specific events. He weighed every way to get his hands on the items. Dungeon drops were random and shaky, but those rare finds only showed up at auctions, and they didn't come cheap at all. He had no plans to follow the script word for word, but he knew he couldn't get in Leon's way, because that would spell disaster. So he kept asking himself if those special, event-only items really should always go to Leon, since giving him the wrong thing could end with the Demon King crushing him. A gentle knock rippled through the lavish room, and a courteous voice asked, "May we come in?" Moments later, Leviana the maid stormed in with a breakfast tray piled high, telling him she brought it straight to him because she feared he wasn't feeling well, only to watch his shoulders drop in relief as he admitted he was starving, praising the coffee, sandwich, and soup like they were pure medicine. He thanked her for the meal, and her face instantly flared red as she stammered that she hadn't earned his thanks at all. She was just doing what a maid does. Still, he doubled back and thanked her again, praising how faithfully she'd taken care of him every single time. As he calmly sipped his coffee, Leviana suddenly got hit with a wave of overwhelm. She clapped a hand over her face as a shaky little sound of distress slipped out. She blurted out a fast apology, sprinted out of the room, and swore she'd be back later for the plates. Then he looked down and saw fresh drops of blood splattering onto the floor right where she'd stood. He could barely process it. She'd gotten so giddy from his simple thanks that a nosebleed burst out, and somehow her intense worship both scared him to death and weirdly enough warmed his heart. Later, still in his school uniform, he strode through the towering halls, thinking with newfound allies at his side, he finally didn't have to sink to desperate moves. Then Zealous, the old butler, came up to him and bowed with a respectful greeting. He immediately grilled Zellies, wondering if this was some plan to rat out his laziness to his father. So Zellies snapped back that his worry came from Xenon skipping the morning garden practice. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was just making sure his well-being, because the head butler's job is to run the estate properly. He faced the old butler, who delivered Lord Baskerville's brutal expectations for Xenon, to grow into someone powerful and unmistakably worthy of the Baskerville name. And he made it clear they truly hoped Xenon wouldn't let those hopes die. Xenon told him he'd meet his father's expectations, admitting he'd still need to pause training sometimes. But there was nothing to worry about, and as the butler lowered his gaze, Xenon only shifted his head, letting out a tiny, smug HMMPH. A fierce spark flashed in his eyes as he snapped that training with sword swings alone wasn't the answer, and he was going to get strong enough to shock his father in his own way. Right as he was about to leave, the butler asked what kind of plan he had to crank his power even higher. A week later, Xenon showed up at the academy like a walking storm, and the whole place went quiet, whispers ripping through the students as his presence oozed menace. Leon stared at him with open, boiling hostility, but Xenon didn't even blink, brushing it off like middle school lessons were nothing, magic sitting in his bones and firing into his mind on instinct, effortless as breathing. As he sat in class, nerves buzzed in his chest, building for the lesson he'd been aching to hear about, and when the female teacher announced today's topic, dungeon exploration, Xenon flashed a quiet, knowing smile while the rest of his classmates visibly cringed with fear. Before anyone stepped out, the teacher snapped that they needed to form parties. Then Xenon leaned in hard as they explained what dungeons really are. Monster-filled lairs, treasure stacked to the sky, and resources that never truly run out. But if you don't keep watch, those places turn into ticking bombs, endlessly coughing up new monsters and more treasure all on their own. They built the academy with one cold purpose: wipe out the monsters lurking in these dungeons and churn out heroes to shield everyone else. And right at the front, a massive, ornate door choked in vines loomed like a warning sign for whoever dared to step into the next death trap. Right in front of that massive entrance, the teacher declared that every party would march into Sage's playground one by one, the academy's own tutorial dungeon. And with his new sword in hand, Xenon braced himself to step in. He stood there like he owned the place, insisting he could handle the tutorial dungeon solo and didn't need a party. Then the female teacher's face tightened with worry, her sharp little sting in her nose giving away that she wasn't convinced his lone run was going to be okay. Xenon shot a quick look over his shoulder, doubling down that he'd handle this solo. Nagisa Sekai, a student who always seemed ready to doubt everyone and hated getting close, lingered right by the dungeon entrance, because the chronicler already knew her path would end with Leon helping her and her finally opening up. At the same time, her teacher shot back a warning. Dungeon solo is a death wish, and especially reckless for a first-timer. Even after the teacher warned him, Xenon shut the idea down, claiming teaming up was totally unnecessary. Nagisa kept it to herself, thinking she needed to stay as far from Leon as possible, because she wanted to limit their contact. With a heavy sigh, the teacher hammered the academy's rule into them. If a student ever died, the academy wouldn't own a thing. So don't go rushing in like you can't think, because even if the dungeon didn't hold any super terrifying monsters, any disaster that happened was on the student. She kept firing up the eager students, warning that every move they made in that dungeon would land in their grades, right as parties started pounding on the door, begging to get inside. The moment she spoke, the students detonated into a competitive frenzy, drowning each other out with non-stop shouts about whose turn it was, and who would be the first to charge in. The chaos kept roaring on as students shoved forward, desperate to be first, and Xenon just watched it all, thinking how badly everyone wanted into that dungeon, like the teacher might pick the order at any moment. He clocked Nagisa's attention and teased that the other students looked totally carefree and reckless, like barging into a dungeon was just another carefree outing. Nagisa then closed in on him, demanded to know what he was even doing, and pointed out that he was the only one not busy. Then she snapped around to the chaotic group and said, "If nobody can pick who goes first, I'll go," claiming the lead as Nagisa Sekai, and Xenon couldn't help but wonder if she was trying to outshine him. With a steely stride, she marched forward like she owned the moment, declaring she would lead. Xenon noticed her bold confidence and praised her surprisingly great personality, but the other students erupted, yelling that what she was doing wasn't fair. She pushed deeper into the tutorial dungeon, cutting through the dark stone corridor like she meant it, her figure shrinking into a distant silhouette while the other students lingered at the entrance, staring after her. While the rest of the students kept tearing each other apart, some snapping at Nagisa for being selfish, others screaming that the whole situation was rigged, Xenon finally snapped. Watching them stall, he roared that wasting time like this was pointless and that the sun was already sinking, then demanded a real choice, rock, paper, scissors, or a lottery. Pick one now. After Leon's outburst, Leon flashed a grin, waved them on, and declared, "It's our turn, we're going." Right then, the teacher stepped in, stunned to see Xenon suddenly calling the shots, and she peppered him with a sharp question. Was he really rethinking his move, since she acted like he had no idea what he was doing? She said it plainly. Being a teacher meant she had to stare the whole situation in the face and really think. She felt the students were shutting him out over his looks and his family name, and then she hit you with the truth. She'd done the exact same thing back then. Then he swung back to her and said, "I just need to confirm one thing about how we enter." She shot back, "You didn't even play rock, paper, scissors either, so are you really allowed to be the last one in?" As they talked, Xenon's mind raced straight into the dungeon's depths, imagining a treasure chest and a sword that practically shone in his hands. Then he couldn't stop wondering if anything he grabbed in there would get hit with that same tax. The teacher made it clear this dungeon was just a school-run lesson, so anything Xenon pulled out wouldn't be taxed. But she also warned the loot here was basically pocket change, even if he sold it, and there were no brutal monsters, so deaths were almost unheard of. Xenon exhaled with relief and promised he'd search as hard as he could. Then she told him, since he was alone, not to wait around if danger spiked. Turn back fast. He nodded and told her he really appreciated her worry, especially from that teacher everyone seems to hate, because yeah, he trusted her and thought she was solid. But then a brutal, sick thought snapped into his head. In the game, she's the one who gets punished in some basement and ends up turned into a dog. He clenched his fist so tight his resolve turned to stone, swearing he'd never let that fate, Dambere 2's nightmare, catch up to him. With a sinister grin, Xenon said it was dungeon time. He strode into the pitch-black corridor, facing whatever waited ahead, back turned on the entrance. The young man snapped into action, eyes blazing, and unleashed a storm of razor-quick strikes, his blade a dark blur as he ignited his shadow edge ability, until the bouncing slime monster shattered into nothing. He surged forward without stopping, his twin swords blazing through the air in brutal, wide arcs, slicing straight through those stubborn, gel-like dungeon creatures that clogged the corridor. He wiped out the creatures, then froze, eyes sharp, gaze narrowing on a tiny crystal object that had fallen from one of them. And the moment he picked it up, he knew it. This dungeon's layout, and the loot it spat out matched the game he swore he'd never forget. His mind drifted over this place's purpose. Since it was just a tutorial dungeon, it only had weak monsters and simple traps, so he could clear it solo without breaking a sweat. Fueled up and fired with fresh grit, he tore back into the battle, spinning through the slimes like a living storm and carving his way through every wave. He swept up the dropped stuff like it was nothing, but that nagging dread wouldn't leave his mind. Because down on the bottom floor, the real monster was waiting for him. He brushed off these so-called foes as Mare's tiny fries, then sprang into the air, blade blazing, as he cut down more of the bouncing, gelatinous horrors. He didn't doubt it for a second. Their numbers meant nothing against his skill. He kept up the aerial assault, smirking like he owned the sky, and snapped that those slimes were nothing but punching bags, just for his training. As he hit the ground, one last slime detonated on him, splashing thick, gooey mess across his face. Yet he still smirked, soaking it all in like this fight was exactly what he came for. He plunged deeper into the dungeon, guided by a thin, glowing ribbon of energy that drifted behind him down the stone steps. And with every step, he decided it was finally time to push on to the next floor. His face tightened up the moment he hit the second floor, a sharp frown pulling hard at his brow. When he hit the second floor, he spotted a small cluster of classmates. Leon sprawled on the ground, face twisted in pain, while Shell and Nagisa scrambled to help him. Leon moaned that he was still weak, admitting his pathetic failure against even the smallest foes in his first dungeon, then swallowed his pride and accepted it. He pushed forward, shoved the injured out of sight, and stormed into a giant, echoing cavern. Slime bodies were strewn across the ground, and as he hacked with his sword, he carved a brutal path straight through the fallen. As he pushed forward, the third floor kept getting uglier, with bodies piling up everywhere. And then he spotted Leon, Shell, and Nagisa sprawled against the dungeon walls, only students who'd actually clawed their way down to this deeper nightmare. Leon, Shell, and Nagisa slumped against the rough dungeon stone, bruised and drained, their faces screaming how brutal the place had been. Shell tried to patch up Leon and warned him that if they ever planned to team up later, they should watch what they did after school too. Leon just stared, his mind spinning on the idea of a cheat skill class, and he secretly scoffed at the thought of partnering with mindless idiots who'd only hold him back. Then boom, out of nowhere, a new woman steps in, Aith, long blonde hair flowing, and she just casually unleashes healing magic so strong it shocks everyone. With a single touch, the injured students, Leon, Shell, and Nagisa included, feel the pain vanish instantly, and they're stunned, gaping at how she keeps casting like her mana is limitless. He stared with his eyes bulging in pure shock, but there was more there too, as Aith kept healing, radiating this calm, unstoppable kind of power. He yanked himself back to reality with a brutal slap across his own face, swearing he'd never let distractions drag him under, then clammed up his doubts and pushed forward. Because if he turned into the NTR kind of protagonist, The Demon King's resurrection was headed for a truly ugly ending. With that decision locked in, he spun his back on Aith and the others and forced himself onward. He just pulled away from his classmates when a familiar face cut in front of him. Aith, asking straight up if he really was Baskerville Sama. While the other students watched, all tense and shaky, Aith stepped forward and declared who she really was, junior student basketball Sama. Then he matched her energy by revealing himself as Country-san, the academy's third-place student. Then he challenged why she was in the tutorial dungeon and what she was really doing there. She smiled softly and offered him healing anyway, like she'd already guessed he'd refuse. She made it crystal clear. She'd never walk away from the injured because her whole mission was to heal everyone she could. Aith Baskerville Sama, at least that's what the chronicler swore, was pure dedication, the kind that sacrifices first, asks questions later. And in the game's history, she repeatedly threw herself into danger just to help people in distress. When the protagonist saw that, he cornered her about why she wouldn't leave, and she kept her cool and said she had her friend's permission to stay and focus on healing the party. Inside his head, he brushed it off as way too buddy-buddy and hopelessly naive. Her brave, self-sacrificing act rattled him at the core, an icy fear he remembered vividly from the game's story. He couldn't stop thinking about people who throw themselves into the fire just to help others, and who gladly trade away their own happiness. Yet even while he admitted she wasn't a villain, her selfless choices still drove him absolutely crazy. He spun away and started walking off, laughing at the idea of her self-sacrifice, and decided he had no business scolding her, so he shoved that job onto the hero instead. She called out asking what was wrong, and he brushed it off, telling her to keep helping people, but pace herself, and then he went back to his lone descent. He doubled down on his resolve. This wasn't his destiny to pull Aith, the wounded saint, out of her never-ending loop of self-sacrifice. Leon handled that. In his mind, he wasn't a hero at all. He was the villain, and he planned to go out in a blaze of glory, leaving the hero spotlight to everyone else. He plunged deeper into the dungeon, and the corridor shrank into a twisting staircase that dropped him straight into the pitch black below. Meanwhile, on the fourth floor, a pack of horned beasts, right behind them, shadowy figures surged forward, ready to crush whoever dared stand in their way. He kept trudging alone, convinced Leon, Shell, and Nagisa had already hit the lowest floor. And yeah, like he expected, none of his other classmates had come close. He remembered that brutal, draconic monster. One Leon had probably already wiped out, proof that this hero's strength was the real deal. When he finally stepped into that huge, cave-like room packed with squirming blob creatures, a sour doubt hit him. Was this really his first dungeon? So he yanked his sword up and got ready to strike. Out of nowhere, a trembling voice screamed for them to back up. Then rocks started to crumble, telling him death would catch them if they didn't move, so he snapped on instinct and bolted straight for the collapsing wall. He burst onto the scene and froze, his eyes going wide as he spotted two classmates right there, one boy badly hurt and barely holding on, and one girl fighting tooth and nail to protect them both. Towering over them was a monstrous gargoyle, so huge it shouldn't exist anywhere except the dungeon's very bottom floor, at least that's what he knew. The injured male student sobbed in agony, yelling at the gargoyle how it could lay a hand on Alicia, while the gargoyle roared back, screaming it would kill humans. As chaos spiraled, he remembered. Leon, Seal, and Nagisa were supposed to take that gargoyle down on the lowest floor, with Leon waking his heroic blood to smash it back. A sudden gut punch hit him. His first guess was dead wrong because he'd completely missed the one key detail. The gargoyle really had escaped from somewhere, and the game's lore hints at it too, while it tore through the upper floors and gunned down several classmates as it ran. A sudden flash of his classmates, Leon, Seal, and Alicia, ripped through his mind, their faces locked in shock and worry. The vision hit harder and sharper. Leon cradled a dying classmate in his arms, his voice shaking with pure anguish as he tore into himself for letting the enemy slip away, and for the death that followed. While Leon was drowning in grief, a dark-haired man stepped in like a nightmare, looming over them and declaring that mob characters were doomed to die. Then he turned and promised Leon would be next. The scene cut straight to a monstrous demon crashing into Leon, its hulking bulk swallowing the cavern, while a dark-haired man watches from the shadows and decides Leon's pain and death will forge his growth, then ignite a hatred for the demon race. As the vision kept rolling, the protagonist wrestled with what interfering would cost, because if he reached out, he might totally rewrite the timeline where Leon finally defeats the Demon King and saves the world. It hit him hard. A brutal truth, yet he felt trapped, forced to shut his eyes to the tragedy playing out. Yet inside the vision, the dark-haired man spun to go, and Leon's desperate plea slammed through the air, begging him to run, yelling that it was all over for him. The dark-haired man's fist tightened instantly, and you could see the war inside his face for a split second. Suddenly, everything shattered back into the present. Then the gargoyle tore loose with a crushing energy blast that sent Leon and Seal stumbling, sure death was seconds away, until a stranger stepped up and blocked the hit. The protagonist stood rock-solid against the roaring gargoyle, declaring with fresh purpose that villainy just wasn't his destiny. Then he lunged forward to take the monster on. Baskerville stood face-to-face with a monstrous demon and declared, "A real hero doesn't ditch their classmates, and you don't freeze up when things get grim, you grow stronger." The demon's rage erupted into a brutal roar, daring him to try escaping. Then a mysterious woman watched it all unfold from the shadows. Baskerville only laughed at the demon's threat, sneering that it was nothing more than a cheap tutorial boss. Then he launched into a brutal assault like he owned the battlefield. He burst through the sky like a comet, unshakable and proud, declaring himself the truly unbeatable villain, so powerful the protagonist couldn't touch him. Then he turned to the demon, sneering that a lowly mob monster couldn't block his path, and ordered it to die for him. His assault just kept hammering on, each brutal swing cracked into the demon and blasted debris through the air. And the beast screamed in agony, yet even through all that fury, Baskerville couldn't deny it. This thing was shockingly tough. Still locked in combat, he snarled with frustration, because that gargoyle's power felt like mid-game monsters, and calling it a stiff wooden doll was the only way to describe how unreal it was. He tried to unleash the shadow edge, but his rusty starter sword clanged uselessly. He couldn't land a single clean strike, and that demon just kept roaring like it didn't even feel a thing. As the demon took to the air, he clocked its insane physical power, but realized its magic resistance was paper-thin, and that sparked a whole new plan. Still, he had to wonder how many spells it would take to break that brute, and you could see strain and fresh injuries crawling across his face. The demon lunged with a blood-curdling roar, screaming it wanted him dead. He knew an enemy like this was built for a whole party to take down, but right now he was stuck facing it alone. With fresh fire in his chest, he swore he'd end this fight with one devastating critical hit, because he finally clocked the demon's weakness and was ready to rip it wide open. He spotted the only weak spot, then slammed in with a crushing blow, driving right through the gargoyle and making it scream in pain as he shouted, "It's here." Turns out the world runs on rules. Every enemy has a weak spot, and for a gargoyle, it's right under its chin. Hit that spot and you land a guaranteed critical. The gargoyle staggered from the hit, then taunted him, sneering about how humiliating it must feel to be an event boss and still get beaten by some lesser foe, especially when he spent so long failing to get revenge on the hero. All it managed was a harsh, guttural sound, like it was forced to admit the human was really there. Suddenly, the gargoyle barked in shock and blasted a vicious health flare as a last-ditch counterattack. Even with that brutal strike, the gargoyle's body started to crumble, rock cracking, form shattering, until it screamed one last, agonizing shriek and got completely obliterated. With the gargoyle finally wiped out, he stared at the road ahead and knew it. This world's strongest starting gig was the magic swordsman, a path he shared with Leon, and there was no way he was going to lose to some weak event boss like that. Then he gathered what was left of the defeated monster, realizing this was the first real fight he'd had since landing in this world, and he called it his win. He wondered what killing the event monster would do to the story no one could predict, but he chose to celebrate one fact. He'd saved a life that was supposed to die in the game's original timeline. And just like that, his focus snapped toward a group of distant figures. As he closed in on the group, he spotted a character crouched over character F who was crumpled and bleeding on the ground, and he barked, "Hey, are you okay?" A character looked up, checked their own safety, and with a heavy breath thanked Baskerville for pulling them out of that dire mess. As the character runners talked, he pointed at a scatter of empty potion bottles on the ground, and a worried frown hid his face because the healing potions were almost gone. He snapped his gaze up, stunned, when Baskerville thrust a hand toward him and shoved healing items his way like, "We need these right now," because the situation was already on the edge. He grabbed the potions and shot one straight into Alicia, who was lying there hurt, and then Baskerville leaned in and told him not to fret. These were cheap. Not long after, Alicia finally stirred, breathing easier and her injuries visibly eased up, and that was when he let out the breath he'd been holding. With Alicia finally stable, he sank into a deep bow to Baskerville, pouring out his heart, grateful for the healing drugs and for wiping out that monstrous gargoyle too. Baskerville waved it all off and said, plain and simple, they were classmates. As he replayed the fight in his head, shame hit him like a wave. He never expected a monster that brutal to crawl out of this dungeon, and he couldn't stand the fact that he'd dropped his guard. His self-punishment kicked into overdrive, knuckles turning white as he tightened his fists. He couldn't stop thinking, if I'd been stronger, none of this happens, my friends would still be alive. Baskerville watched him like a hawk, clocking every painful spark of self-blame burning in him. Baskerville then leaned in and told him, if you really feel responsible, get stronger so you can protect your friends when it matters. And deep down, Baskerville couldn't ignore it. This person carried an absurd level of duty, way more than you'd expect from some background nobody. He swallowed Baskerville's words like a punch to the gut, instantly seeing the truth, and swore he'd get stronger just like him. Then Baskerville, with a humble grin, told him he didn't have to be an example. Just throw everything he had into academy life and do his best. He spun back to Baskerville, admitted he'd gotten it wrong, and promised a real apology. Baskerville just shrugged and said he'd already heard about his irritation, then accepted it. He admitted that at first he'd pegged Baskerville as a total menace, between that scary look and the family's bad name. But then it hit him. Baskerville was actually a good guy, and Baskerville just smirked like he already knew. Yeah, I know that. His mind kept replaying Baskerville's selfless act, how he could have bylayed, but instead charged straight into danger to save them, even handing over his precious healing potions. He also remembered how he and the others had shut Baskerville out in the classroom, and remorse hit like a wave. He bowed again, admitting he was dead wrong and begging for forgiveness. He replayed all his old judgments and realized he'd totally misread Baskerville. Sure, that face looked scary to everyone, but it hid the real him underneath, and the truth hit him like a punch of embarrassment, especially because this was the first time he'd spoken to a classmate since he'd turned into a loner. Standing there, the protagonist cleared his throat, then handed him something small and said, "Here." While he was still thinking, the protagonist thrust a tiny, fancy charm into his hands and said it was packed with incense that can drive monsters back. Then told him to use it, and to take his time as he finally made his way out of the dungeon. The protagonist squared things away and said the incense wouldn't work on strong foes. It had only hit the weaker kind, the sort you'd usually stumble into in that dungeon. Character Runners 3 beamed with real gratitude and swore he'd repay this favor for good. He even admitted he'd already owed the protagonist too many times. The protagonist just smirked, flashed a thumbs up, and told him repayment can wait, because the mission comes first. With a laid-back "see ya," he sent Character Under free on his way, while up above, shadowy wolf-like monsters hovered, crackling with sick electric energy. The path plunged deeper into the dungeon, until it finally spit them out at the playground of the wise, the very bottom floor. Meanwhile, deep in the dungeon, the rest of the crew huddled on edge, until a lone figure burst from a doorway's shadows. Character _ jerked back, eyes wide, and shouted, "Baskerville." The protagonist, messy but totally unhurt, glanced around and asked if everyone was okay, and the character watching him just nodded and said that kind of toughness was exactly what you'd expect from the hero's descendant. Still stunned by the shock, Character A snapped that he needed answers. Was protagonist the one behind this mess, and how the heck did he know they were in danger? The protagonist shrugged it off and snapped that he had no clue what they were even mad about. Then figured they must have run into the same brutal monster he'd faced earlier, because that was the only thing that made sense. Shaken by the recent attack, Leon crumpled with guilt, hiding his face in his hands, convinced he should have stopped it. Nagisa hurried over, staring like he'd just defied fate. How was he still standing after the monster's strike? Leon nodded, relieved he was alive, but the words turned heavy as he admitted it all. His classmates were hurt, and it was his failure. As Leon sank deeper into despair, Seal clung to him and sobbed nonstop, begging him to stop blaming himself. Because if he hadn't protected her, she and Nagisa would have been dead for sure. His anguish surged as he screamed, convinced that if he'd only crushed the monster for real, their classmates would have been safe. Yet all he could do was clench his fist and admit, through gritted teeth, that he felt completely powerless, even as the cruel thought hit him. How could he, supposedly a descendant of a hero, be this weak? Alicia stared at him with a heavy, silent look, while Nagisa, still right there, snapped "damn it" under her breath. Leon stayed hunched, his despair practically leaking off him, and from afar G just called out, "Leon." Meanwhile, out of the chaos, the protagonist just stood there, chin in hand, eyes locked in deep thought like he could feel the next move coming. Leon, Alicia, and Seal huddled back with the group and knelt together, their eyes burning with dread. Because this moment of crushing regret was the exact pivot that, in the original timeline, let the enemy slip away, and that single mistake cost a classmate their life. The protagonist stood alone in that grand, echoing hall, staring up like answers were written in the ceiling, while the chronicler wrestled with the nightmare of an altered timeline. If everything's changed already, will Leon still hit the same crucial growth the original story promised? Or will he take a completely different path in this new reality? Leon, battered and bleeding, drove his fist into the ground, his face twisting with brutal self-hatred as he spat out curses, fuming that he was still this weak, and refusing to forgive himself for how he looked right then. As he dropped to his knees, hurt and shaking, Alicia told him he'd still managed to save them even with the damage they were taking. Nagisa knelt right beside him and snapped him out of the guilt, insisting that if he hadn't acted, she and the rest of their classmates would have been hit way harder. The protagonist watched it all with a grim, serious stare. The protagonist stayed locked on, wondering what Leon would become next. But he knew nobody could predict how he'd grow from here, so he forced himself to focus on what he could actually do right now. A few seconds later, the protagonist snapped his attention to Leon and asked, "You good? Do you still need anything?" Then he threw a final word. "All right, I'm heading out now. Be careful on your way back." He told them he had to race ahead and begged Leon to speak up fast if there was anything left to say. And Leon, clearly shaken, managed to whisper a quiet, heartfelt thank you. Leon bowed so deeply it looked like he'd hit the floor, thanking the protagonist for fixing his mess and even handing medicine to the injured classmates, while the protagonist just stared in shock at this sudden, humble side from someone who'd been nothing but hostile before. Leon's cheeks burned as he quickly threw out a warning. "Don't get the wrong idea about what's his," he insisted, while the protagonist could only think, like clockwork, that Leon was headed for the life he'd always been meant to live. He stormed off with venom in his voice, swearing he'd never forgive a monster like the protagonist and that justice would come for him. Then the protagonist shouted after him, begging him to wait. Shock hit him as a brand new figure strode up, a young woman with long dark hair and a katana strapped at her hip, staring him down and firing the question. Was he the one who'd just taken down the gargoyle? He shot back a sly little smirk, dodging the truth with one sharp question. "So what if it was me?" She flashed a knowing smile, eyes sparkling like she'd seen this coming, and said her instincts never let her down. Because sure enough, his aura wasn't just different, it was the only one in the whole class. She challenged him to a spar, convinced that fighting real monsters was the only way to level up. While inside, the protagonist groaned, because now those annoying people were officially on his trail, and he could already feel the brutal days coming as she strode off. Deeper in the dungeon, a colossal ornate throne sat on a raised platform, glowing with that eerie, ethereal light, like the clear chamber's beating heart. He faced the glittering throne and spotted a little box stuffed with coins. Then, even better, a medal that screamed, "You did it." And when he lifted it up high, he confirmed he'd beaten the dungeon and nailed the mission, with only minimal injuries to show for it. He studied the medal and felt the truth hit him. Yeah, beating that gargoyle was brutal, but just forcing it back wasn't enough. If he left without grabbing the medal, the floor wouldn't count as cleared, and that's the kind of rookie mistake every Danbury player learns the hard way. Then his mind snapped back to Leon and the others. Did they remember to grab their medals? He wouldn't be shocked if they blanked, and if they did, he'd already be ready to offer his condolences. But for now, he had to plan his next move. He started pushing ahead, fingertips scraping over the rough stone wall as he hunted for a way through, while the drip of water boomed back and echoed around him in the tight dark. A massive chamber stretched out before him, packed to the ceiling with glittering gold coins, a wild pile of weapons and armor, and every kind of treasure imaginable stacked so high they were practically spilling into the stone walls. He suddenly stood buried in an ocean of riches, coins raining out of his hands as he blurted that this was the legendary room of the nouveau rich. And he just couldn't believe it, since a room like this usually only shows up after a dungeon gets cleared at least twice. The room kept stretching into darkness, and then, boom, more gold and treasures piled up everywhere. Chests, shields, and magical artifacts glittering as if some hidden light was feeding them, like this stash was about to unlock a fortune no one could even count. Among the treasures, a sleek little black bag with stunning designs snatched his attention, and he knew it. An honest-to-God's magic bag that could swallow up countless items. That magic bag was the ultimate game-changer, an irreplaceable item that could stash endless gold and even the loot from past dungeon clears, the kind of tool every adventurer dreams of having. With a burst of joy, he sprang into the air, yanking the magic bag tight and cackling like he'd won everything. Because once he saw all that gold and those priceless items, he instantly felt like a billionaire, locked in for life. Fuel ignited in him, and he blurted, "It's time, loot it all." Then he tore around and snatched up every stray potion, staff, sword, and gem, stuffing them into his fresh magic bag as he chased his bounty. Suddenly, a brutal pain slammed into his chest, and he grabbed himself, eyes bulging in shock as panic ripped through him. Then dark, jagged cracks tore across reality like a nightmare unfolding. He just stared in shock as the cracks kept widening. And then, right out of that shimmering void, a radiant, earth-shaking blade started to rise from the mountain of treasure. The demon blade, heavenly feather cutter. That sword, shaped like a Japanese katana, etched with crimson veins that pulsed through the blade, was the exact weapon he'd carried in his old world. The one he'd honed for endless hours, hunted the materials for, and paid blacksmiths to forge until it could beat even the holy sword Excalibur from the back half of the story. And when he saw it here, awe hit him so hard it felt like his heart just skipped, because his beloved blade had somehow crossed into this world too. He fixed his eyes on the demon blade, heavenly feather cutter blazing with raw power, and he instantly knew one thing. If he pushed his skills to the limit, this could slam the Demon King even on hard mode, so the fact his own sword showed up here could only mean one. He was being set up for something huge. That gut punch of a realization made him stare at the massive treasure room all around, every corner packed with endless loot, and he couldn't help thinking, was this whole place loaded with items straight out of his saved data? He stared into the distance, brow knitted tight, realizing that these things didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They were born from his own saved data from the game Dambor he used to play, and that meant there was a deep, unsettling link tied to him. That thought slammed and echoed in his head, one crushing question burning in his mind. Who on earth had actually pulled off something that should have been impossible? Gazing at that glittering mass of bodies, he finally got it. This wasn't some accidental drop into a new life, and Xenon's body wasn't something he chose. If he'd ended up here, then someone had willed his reincarnation into this exact world on purpose. He kept tearing into the mystery, asking why he'd been reincarnated as a side character like Xenon instead of the main guy, Leon. Because a reincarnation this exact couldn't be random. Something had to be driving it, and he didn't know if a god or a devil was pulling the strings. All he knew was he had to crack their plan, why they dumped him into this world, and how they somehow dragged his saved data with him. Bursting out of the dungeon, he was still trapped in the storm of those big questions when a voice he knew all too well snapped his attention. It was Aith, the wise one, who'd been waiting right there for him. She thrust her hand forward and flicked a tiny, gleaming object straight at him. "Catch it?" she barked. He snatched it instinctively, and the second he did, he knew exactly what it was, a dungeon-clear medal. When he snatched the medal, Aith slapped her hands together and beamed at him. Then she rose into a proper, ceremonial voice. "Xenon Baskerville-kun, I hereby acknowledge that you've cleared the sage's playground." Behind her, Leon, Seal, Nagisa, and the rest stared, half-stunned, half-buzzing with curiosity at this wild surprise announcement. He replayed the dungeon clear in his mind and realized Leon and the others never even noticed the medal. So he started wondering if the whole thing, even the gargoyle's surprise attack, was some kind of test. Then Aith, the sage, officially gave him the go-ahead to hunt other dungeons, praised him for pushing through and beating the boss, and still warned him to take it easy, because that gargoyle showing up out of nowhere wasn't something he could just shrug off. As he strode through the city streets, he couldn't stop thinking about the gear and odds and ends he'd snagged from that nouveau rich's room, only to realize he couldn't use most of it until he leveled up his skills. And the more he tried to push on alone, the more the limits of solo adventuring screamed at him, pushing him toward the idea that he'd better find companions. He kept grinding on his problem, realizing that the top-tier dungeons clamped down hard on solo adventurers, and that he needed to level up his skills. Yet he straight-up rejected the idea of weakening himself with worse weapons, because that plan brought zero real advantage. He then stared into the nightmare of it all, paralysis, petrification, and the kind of death that hits unless someone there can purify. So yeah, poison might be soothed by medicine, but companions were the only real lifeline, and still he blew out a frustrated sigh, stuck with only himself. His mind started sprinting through every option for company. Leon and his crew were out, and the rest of his classmates weren't worth the risk, so it boiled down to two brutal choices. Grab some sketchy mercenaries who could ditch him or pocket his loot, or take slaves, legal in the Slayer Kingdom, bound by enslavement magic so their loyalty sticks, at least for a long time. He wrestled with the horror of buying slaves, something that sickened him since he'd grown up in a far better world. But when his own life hung in the balance, he finally swallowed his pride and admitted there was no real choice left. A chilling truth hit him like a truck. There were no second chances in this world. With this burning understanding, he swore he'd never quit, no matter what it cost. He had to survive, and if that meant forcing himself to gain loyal subordinates by owning slaves, he'd do it, even if it tore his personal ideals apart. A winding path spilled them straight into a massive slave auction, where towering, ornate tents hid the ugly dance of greed and desire, pulling anyone who wanted to buy or be bought right in. A dignified butler greeted the basketball family's young master at the door, swept him inside, and ushered him into a front-row seat. Then the kid gave a soft, respectful thanks. He stared down the brutal truth of his path. If he wanted to face his father, the kingpin at the top of the underworld, he'd have to crawl into business with filthy slave traders first, and only then could he build a crew of men working under him. Moments later, the auctioneer, clean-cut in a crisp white suit, slammed the air with a booming announcement, kicking off the slave auction as everyone in the hall leaned in, his voice ricocheting everywhere. The moment the auction kicked off, they dragged out 3 chained souls, a skinny, frail girl, a scarred, muscular bruiser, and a woman who looked dangerous enough to tempt anyone. Then the bids exploded fast. 100,000, 500,000, 650,000, 700,000, while the young master watched with a tight, pained seriousness on his face. The first lot raked in $800,000, and the auctioneer practically beamed as the winner was crowned. Then, boom, the next item hit the block. A stunning blonde, blue-eyed boy bidding snapping to life at $100,000, and the young master stared at everything like he couldn't blink. He sized up his money situation. Grinning because his pockets were stuffed to the brim with gold he'd ripped from the nouveau riches room, more than enough to buy 1 or 2 slaves. He weighed his perfect buy in his mind. Someone with real fighting talent could be worth a fortune. And then a carved, lifelike slave idol was paraded for a moment, all detailed and eerie. He pressed a strange relic to his eye and realized it was God's eye, the artifact he'd snatched from the nouveau riches room, meant to appraise monsters' abilities. On the auction block, a bunch of people sat chained and collared, staring at the same grim fate. There was a hulking, muscular man, a skinny little girl barely holding on, an irresistible woman, a tall woman who looked too calm to be safe, and even a stern, muscle-bound brute, all of them silently screaming their own story. He realized the God's eye wasn't just useful. It let him read his opponents mid-battle, spotting every skill and talent with terrifying clarity. He thought this item would let him instantly spot whether a potential acquisition actually had combat-ready skills. But the moment he considered those built only for charm, he shot the idea down as useless for what he really needed. As he kept watching the slaves, disappointment crushed him. None of the new ones had the exact talents he was hunting. And sure, skills could be trained later, but real inborn abilities sprouted faster and hit harder, so that's what he truly wanted. With a heavy sigh, he turned his back on the auction block and scanned the crowd, like he couldn't stand the selection on offer. Right when he was about to quit for the day and try new ways, the auctioneer's voice thundered through the hall, calling out the final slave of the day. With a wild flourish, the auctioneer roared that the next prize was an Oni girl from the northern demi-human continent, so rare it could make even the dragon kid feel common. His eyes snapped wide with shock as the auctioneer's words hit him, and pure disbelief flashed across his face. He locked onto the newly presented slave and stared hard at the young girl's white hair and pale skin. Those blazing golden eyes with crimson horns, the dead giveaway of the Anis, the demi-human race. He recognized the type instantly, an Ulza white ogre, rare and deadly. Then the question burst out of him, why in the world would something like that be here of all places? He fixed his eyes on the Ulza white ogre up on the auction block, and it hit him, hard. This couldn't be right. Ulza wasn't even supposed to exist in the world of Dambor. He remembered that Ulza first showed up in another war simulation game, *** Warriors of the Holy Sea ***, made by the same team as Dambori, set on a South Sea island nation where you recruited allies and crushed enemy nations, and Ulza was supposed to be one of the big, game-changing allies. So why was she suddenly standing in Dambori's world? The young master stared into the chaos, feeling the game's rules start to smear at the edges, and he couldn't stop asking what in the world was really happening in this place. Meanwhile, the auction kept roaring along. Bids shot up fast as the crowd fought tooth and nail for the legendary Ulza White Ogre. The auctioneer knew exactly what he was chasing, an insanely rare one that ages slowly and fights like a beast, so everyone wanted her the moment she hit the block. He kept wrestling with the same question in his head. Maybe this world was stitched together from Dambore 1 and 2 plus the Holy Sea, or maybe it was one single world all along, unchanged from the very start. The bids rocketed to 5 million, and he smirked like, yeah, it makes sense. Danbury and the Holy See could totally be linked, same creator, even if their worlds feel different. Then he snapped on his god's eye, locked onto Ulza and clocked her power. Her core gift, a physical boost at level 11, super strength at level 13, and hammer mastery at level 9. He let out a satisfied breath, 3 innate skills all built for combat, the exact kind of talent he'd been hunting. Then a fresh problem hit. If the Holy See world is really linked to the bigger story, what happens to Ulz, born a slave, later rising into the main character's orbit? Would buying her slam her into those same events, and drag him straight into the protagonist's Holy See plot? He kept his eyes locked on the auction hall, staring through the crowd as his mind raced over every dangerous move he could make. The auctioneer's voice snapped through his thoughts, 6,500,000, and he rose like a force of nature, eyes locked on Ulza, still chained to that platform. With a sharp snap of his hand, he shouted his bid, 10 million. His fist tightened like a vow, and when Ulza stared up at him, her eyes went wide with pure shock. He shot his hand up and threw down an offer for 10 million. Then the room erupted, because that wild price tag left everyone blinking in shock, whispering how anyone could justify burning that kind of money on just one rare demi-human girl. He finally clocked the real price. 10 million could outfit a whole squad with top-tier gear for the final boss in a game, and regret hit him hard at how reckless it all was. His mind wouldn't stop racing as the weight of his choice crushed him. Save the White Ogre right now, before the noble's cruelty shatters her heart, and the Holy See Game's whole war could flip on its head. But what if stepping in rewrites the future instead? He clenched his jaw, staring down the heartbreak he knew was coming for her, and told himself Holy Sea's hero could roll with a few plot twists, because he refused, absolutely refused, to turn into a full-on villain like Xenon. Meanwhile, Auctioneer Beaming leaned into the mic and blared, 10 million, daring anyone to raise a bid against that handsome. The other bitterly stood there frozen, faces twisted with pure shock as 10 million bits hit the air. 10 million, whispered and rippling through the crowd like a bombshell. The auctioneer, drenched in sweat, stared in tight-lipped suspense as the young man, now seated, spilled out a dark, menacing presence, his eyes shining with unshakable determination. He leaned back with a cocky smirk, fully convinced his villainous scowl was unbeatable, and then the Ulza White Ogre on the stage stared up at him, surprise flashing across her face, confusion right behind it. He faced her head-on and told her she had nothing to fear, yet she still flinched, clearly trying to catch up with how fast everything had spun. He flashed her a shaky but reassuring smile and said he was just trying to help her, and the Ulza White Ogre blushed, quickly looking away. Out of nowhere, a seasoned gentleman in the crowd shot his hand up, grinning like he'd just pulled off the perfect move, bidding a jaw-dropping 10,500,000, and the auctioneer froze, blinking in shock as he stammered the wild counteroffer, wondering if anyone else would dare top it. He froze in disbelief, eyes bulging as the auctioneer's voice thundered and slammed down a fresh bid, 12 million. The crowd erupted into a jittery hush of shock and pure adrenaline, and with a dramatic flourish, the auctioneer declared the only girl had finally been sold for that insane price, calling for applause for the young man who won her. That young protagonist shot a confident smirk and lifted his hand to the roaring cheers blasting through the crowd, like he already knew he'd done it. He won. Moments later, he stormed off the main auction floor, gripping a small, ornate book in his fist as he slipped toward a private curtained corner. Behind thick drapes in a locked private chamber, Ulz stood alone, her fragile silhouette lit by a ghostly glow as she waited, eyes fixed for her new master. The second he stepped in, Ulza snapped her attention onto him, grinning like something good just happened. She introduced herself as Ulza, then cheekily clung to his leg and blurted out how thrilled she was to meet her new master, leaving him only able to make a stunned little sound. Then she blurted out her unstoppable devotion, swearing she'd love him forever and throw her all into working for his sake. While he froze, baffled by this sudden turn, remembering that back in the Holy See, Ulza had always been as expressionless as a doll. He wondered if her bright, puppy-like cheer was really who she was, or if the past had twisted her into something else. Ulza clocked the silence on his face and asked what hurt, and all he managed was, "It's nothing." But deep down, he finally understood. This warm version of her was probably the real her before she got sold into slavery and dragged through brutal treatment. He realized that if he took her out dressed like that, his already shaky reputation would crash fast, and someone would definitely snitch on him. He spun to his butler and snapped that he couldn't haul Ulza back like that, then demanded to know if Leopold had a spare set of clothes ready. The butler let out a sly chuckle, like he already knew. There just might be something perfect waiting in the slaves' waiting room. As the moment finally hit for Ulza to get fitted for fresh clothes, protagonist gently soothed her, promising her there was nothing to fear, and that he'd be right there waiting. He told her to go with Leopold, but Ulza wouldn't let go. She clung to him and kept asking, "Will you really wait for me?" Plain as day that she didn't want to leave his side. Meanwhile, he stood surrounded by racks of clothes, eyes darting over every style and fabric, trying to figure out the perfect outfit for her. Then he sank into the chair, slipping out of his lips as he wrestled with the shock of Ul's transformation and the scary new bond she'd formed. Moments later, a voice snapped from behind the changing curtain, announcing she was done, and he shot back for her to step out and show off her new look. Her new elegant shoes first slipped out from behind the curtain, and that was the cue. The full transformation was about to blow everyone's mind. Ulza tore through the curtains with a happy little flourish, proudly showing off her brand new black shoes, and Xenon snapped awake, jolting her for rushing in. Because just putting on shoes wasn't the whole job, she had to get completely dressed. Yet somehow Ulza only grinned wider, buzzing with the joy of finally having them. While Xenon wrestled with the situation, the butler cut in fast, warning him not to take Ul's collar off, especially since it was right there on Ul's neck, engraved with Xenon Baskerville, and that name felt like it was pressing down on him. Ulza snapped out the truth. If someone yanked off her collar, she'd be turned into an ownerless slave, and that meant real danger was right around the corner, no escape. She even pointed out the collar was stamped with her young master's name, Xenon. The butler drummed up the horrors, saying slaves with no master didn't have a single human right, and when Xenon stood there with his arms crossed, he demanded specifics. What exact dangers was he talking about? Then the butler painted a brutal picture. Ulza and Oni could be targeted and exploited without anyone batting an eye. He warned that if someone snatched or assaulted her in public and she didn't have her collar on, it wouldn't even count as a crime, and he acted it out like a nightmare. People getting attacked, yanked away, and dragged off as the cold warning. Xenon winced as the truth slammed into him the moment he remembered what it really meant. Then the butler drove it home. If Ul's place as Xenon's property wasn't crystal clear, someone could swoop in and try to grab her on the spot. The world's brutal truth hit harder in the Slayer Kingdom. Demi-humans were shoved to the bottom, and in plenty of towns they were nothing but slaves. It wasn't random cruelty either. The kingdom's feud with the elves and dwarves had turned into a nasty excuse. Ulza, horns and all, was unmistakably demi-human, and if she didn't have a slave collar on, she'd be branded, run away, and dragged into the kind of torture only runaway slaves get. Still, Xenon told himself he had zero intention of keeping any girl collared. Ulza lifted her gaze to Xenon with a glowing smile and said the collar was proof she belonged to him, and that she loved it. Her sincere acceptance totally threw Xenon off. She stared at Xenon as his doubts twisted, and he finally admitted, "If you're truly okay with that collar, then I won't push it anymore," even though the whole situation still left him unconvinced. The butler stepped in and offered to escort Xenon to his room, promising no one would barge in for a while, so they'd finally get real privacy. He watched the butler storm out, and suddenly he was trapped in this ultra-lavish room, glowing romantic lights, and a huge heart-shaped bed sitting there like a trap. Xenon wondered if the butler had totally misread what he meant. Moments later, Ulza, already in the room, let out an excited cry and started stripping off her simple dress, practically bursting with readiness to begin. His eyes snapped wide with panic as she kept stripping, and he burst out, voice cracking, demanding to know why she was suddenly undressing. He snatched a shirt into her hands and shut the whole thing down fast, saying he wasn't some lullican and had zero interest in little girls. Yet Ulza blinked innocently and asked, "So we're not making babies anymore?" He jabbed her forehead with a hard poke and told her they'd have to get her gear, because there was no way she was stepping into a dungeon dressed like that. The second dungeon hit her ears, her eyes lit up with pure excitement, and Xenon quickly made it crystal clear. He'd never turn her into some sex slave. He'd only bought her to jack up his combat power once they stepped into that dungeon. Even as a slave, she was practically vibrating with pure joy, saying stepping into a dungeon felt like her wildest dream, and that she absolutely loved throwing down. Her grin lit up as she bragged about wanting to slaughter and snatch everything in sight, and Xenon's own hand gave the nod like, "Yeah, that's totally Oni's spirit, a warrior race that lives for the next fight." Xenon replayed Ul's earlier words in his head, struggling to match that sweet, adorable face with the terrifying stuff that came out of her mouth. So he just nodded along to her excitement, not really knowing what else to do. Then he swept her into a massive chamber and unveiled a glittering mountain of weapons, armor, and accessories, and Xenon stood right beside it. itching to gear her up for whatever adventures hit next. He told her he couldn't gear her himself, but he'd already loaded up every piece of equipment and weaponry meant for his female companion. Because he'd been waiting for the day, a woman finally joined his team. Then he leaned in and asked if those accessories and weapons were actually right for her from the start. Ulza practically bounced with excitement, saying she understood right away. Then Xenon told her to try the equipment first, promising they could fix anything if trouble popped up. Moments later, Ulza burst back out in a whole new, way more practical getup, crop top, short skirt, and arm guards, and she swore the gear felt perfect, while Xenon just watched her shift with a deep, thoughtful stare. Her fresh outfit hit like a battle-ready upgrade. Sturdy boots dug into the ground, and a reinforced collar sealed the warrior look tight. Then she slammed a huge, spiked club into view and bragged that armor and weapons like this were nearly unheard of even in human kingdoms. Xenon instantly clocked it. A blunt Oni club built for ruthless tyranny, one swing to send enemies flying off their feet and another to crush their skulls. He knew these usually came from goblins and demanded blunt weapon skills, which almost nobody in the game actually had, so this thing just kept getting used. Ulza spun that heavy club like it weighed nothing at all, blurted out how much she loved it, and promised to treat her master's present with care, while Xenon grinned and said it fit her perfectly, though he still couldn't shake the worry that it might be too much weight for her. With steel in her gaze, Ulza swore she'd throw everything she had into cutting down Xenon's enemies. Club in hand, she dared any foe to step up. Xenon just chuckled, grinning because she actually meant it. As she kept swinging that club, Xenon watched, fighting off a wild thought. Were all Oni this obsessed with brawling, and didn't she realize every hit was risking her own body? Ulza, fully loaded with gear, clung to Xenon and blurted out that she loved him, while Xenon froze, baffled, and demanded why she was so crazy about him after such a short time, especially when he'd only picked her up to help him explore dungeons. She spilled her feelings and said her master was cool, handsome, and the best gentleman ever, which made her glow with happiness for being his. Then Xenon heard it and snorted inside, wondering if she really saw him at all, because to him those sharp, angled features screamed villain. He kept drowning in his own misery, replaying how the girls in his class wouldn't just avoid him. They'd scream when he laughed, then bolt out of sight, and right beside all that, Ul's fresh, sturdy combat boots were standing out loud as day. Even with her doubts swirling, Ul steadied her voice and swore she meant it, then laid out exactly why she adored him, painting her perfect man with ruthless, killer eyes, a pointy evil nose, and teeth so sharp they could rip through flesh like it was nothing. A legendary one and only god. At the auction, the second their eyes locked, she blurted that she already knew. This was love at first sight, and she truly felt like fate meant to be claimed by such a lovely master. Xenon, hit with that shocking praise, froze with a strange new feeling, like tears were crawling up even though she was the first girl to ever compliment him. He nodded to her feelings, admitting he couldn't honestly call himself satisfied, but at least this beat her hating him, and he pushed her to wrap up the last changes so they could finally leave. As Ulza, fully suited in her brand new combat gear and gripping her club, bolted out of the room, all fire and focus. The butler watched her go and muttered that the young master's feelings were just as fierce as the boss's, then his eyes shifted back to the door. The butler stepped up to Xenon, bowed deep, and swore he'd bring better slaves for the next auction. Then he waited like a loyal shadow for Xenon's call, but Xenon was done with the whole thing, brushed him off, and snapped that it was too much trouble to even bother fixing his wrong assumptions. Outside, the city streets were dead quiet under the evening sky, streetlights washing everything in a soft glow, while Xenon got ready to bolt out of the auction house district. As they strolled through the city, Xenon clocked the missing annoying stairs. The route was so much easier right now. It hit him they'd need about an hour to get home, so they'd better roll in before sundown. And there was Ulza, lugging that massive club, yet moving with weird, effortless lightness, like a total bunny. As Ul strode forward, a sudden glint snapped into view, and his sharp eyes locked onto it instantly. She clutched his jacket with pure instinct, no words, just a sharp warning. Ulza, now gripping a terrifying spiked club, swung his way and made him blurt, "What's wrong?" His eyes shot wide. He caught the danger she'd sensed the second it hit. In the dim glow of that tight street, three menacing figures burst out of the shadows and slam into their path, cutting off every way forward. Xenon and Ulza kept moving like nothing could touch them, while alleyways and behind every wall, more figures pressed in, closing the net tight around them. From the dark, the same butlers step out like clockwork, announcing their reunion. Xenon flicks a look over his shoulder, smirks at the ambush, and gives them credit for a job well done. The butler's face snapped into a smug, evil grin, like he'd just set the trap to perfection. Then he blew up in a furious rant, yelling at Xenon. "So you really don't remember me after dropping 12 million Xenon on this?" He even compared himself to a lonely pebble by the roadside, furious that he'd been erased from her mind, only for Xenon to just point at him and ask, calm as ever, "Wait, who are you again?" A jolt of realization hit Xenon as he finally caught the butler's meaning. This guy was the one behind it all, and he'd just blown far more at the auction than Xenon ever planned. He stormed up to the butler and demanded to know what kind of loser would dare step into his world, especially after dragging those intimidating thugs with him. Yet the butler stayed calm, apologized politely, and said auctions are all about winning and losing, then asked Xenon for his forgiveness. Even after his apology, the butler's face twisted into a creepy grin as he lured Xenon in, swearing it was a fun party, and begging him to come along. Then, under his breath, he spit out a nasty slur that screamed just how much he despised him. The butler's smiles looked soaked in spite while rage burned in his chest as he realized Xenon still hadn't given up on Ulza, and that losing her was pure agony. Then he snapped to Xenon, asking if it was fine for him to just snatch this pseudo-human Ulza. He promised that if Xenon agreed, it would be just broken bones, but if Xenon fought back, it would get way, way uglier. While the butler talked, Xenon and Ulza got boxed in. Armed thugs swarmed the desolate cobblestone alley, and every escape route slammed shut. From a high perch, the butler snapped his demand again, telling Xenon to hand Ulz over. Xenon stared up at him, a daring, almost amused grin tugging at his lips even as they closed in. Then he started weighing his next move. Xenon, still young and sharp-eyed, stared at the heavy-set butler who chuckled like he was hiding something, then asked straight up about pseudo-human. A word everyone in his country knows, yet apparently nobody here does. The butler finally admitted it meant demi-humans with bodies shaped like humans, and Xenon couldn't help wondering if it was just him who'd ever heard the term before. Meanwhile, the little demon girl Ulza stood her ground like a storm, spiked club gripped tight, fury blazing in her eyes, because the idea of demi-humans being treated like they're beneath everyone else made her snap with pure rage. Back with Xenon and the butler snapped that he'd beat Xenon and kick him out. He'd never hand over Ulza because she was his woman and he wasn't letting her go. Hearing that, Ulza blushed hard and got choked up with emotion, but the butler's rage then flared. He couldn't stand undisciplined brats, and if Xenon so much as dared to throw his life away, the butler would kill him on the spot. Consumed by his ambition, the butler started picturing the massive cash he'd need to cough up 12 million in one shot, convinced he was high status and untouchably noble, like the world couldn't possibly turn on him that fast. Then he snapped that he couldn't hold back anymore. If he could get the girl, he'd climb even higher, because offering up a rare pseudo-human like an Oni would win over the right powerful man and make him his trusty right hand. While the butler ranted with wild, over-the-top gestures, Xenon clocked him instantly. This was a guy from the Quran Kingdom, and Xenon knew exactly who he was. Xenon then leaned on the butler's command and demanded, "Tell me, was the man I named earlier the Jitros, Marshal General of the Quran Kingdom?" The butler's expression twisted into a stunned gasp, completely reeling at how much Xenon already knew. Still stunned by the shock, the butler stammered, "How did you know Xenon?" Xenon only smirked and shot back, "Was I right?" Then the narrator dropped the truth. They couldn't recall the mob character's name, but he and Jitros were enemies too, holy sea foes through and through. Deep in a pitch-black cavern, demi-human girls were locked away in separate cages, and among them was Ulza, destined to be snapped up as a slave by General Jitros, a monster who hunted young demi-humans from every race with a sick, perverse obsession. Xenon mulled over the shock and realized it all clicked. The butler's move of offering Ulza to Jitros was probably the same credit that earned him a seat as the general's aide, and that clarity hit hard as he remembered another story too. A Holy See protagonist saving a demi-human girl and becoming her companion. The butler snapped, eyes wide, and blurted out how Xenon had figured out his identity, and who his boss was to him, but Xenon stayed ice-calm, saying he owed nobody any answers about where he got it. With his true identity finally out in the open, the butler's calm snapped like glass. He clenched his fist, twisted into furious rage, and roared that Xenon would die on the spot, sending a signal to the ambushers already waiting. He picked apart the butler's subnegression in no time. Then Xenon clocked that odd noble from the Quran Kingdom had stepped into his territory, before he gladly swung back hard at the attack that followed. He mulled over the mess and realized, again, he'd slipped into the Holy See's disaster like he always did, but at least cutting down the enemies couldn't possibly hurt the protagonist of that story. Xenon spun toward Ulza, said her very first job was on the way, and told her to get her weapon ready, then even tossed out a quick thanks for letting him take her. While Ulza, clutching a brutal spiked club, grinned and went, "All righty." With that adorably fierce face, she stood poised like a real warrior, though deep down she knew her master wanted her to hold back. At the same time, Xenon thrust up his hand and conjured the ancient grimoire of dark magic right into the world. He started chanting, and arcane symbols burst up from the ground around him as he lined up his spell. While the butler, seeing that raw power, panicked and yelled at his men to kill Xenon before it was too late. With a savage, almost demonic grin, Xenon tore into his dark AoE magic, blood carpet, and the spell detonated, swallowing the whole area in a roaring wave of destruction. His dark magic tore open the earth, and a blood-stained carpet of brutal obsidian spikes erupted like a storm, spearing the ambushers and blasting their bodies through the air. The brutal assault raged on, spikes ripping through flesh and ringing out brutal screams, while the butler, caught in the first violent surge, got thrown tumbling to the ground. Xenon stared at the brutal aftermath, a hand clamped over his mouth as nausea crashed over him, and he realized the dark magic wasn't mercy, it was pure torture, the same kind his father used to unleash. Twisting toward Ulza, he said, cool as ice, that the only threats left were the ambushers creeping up behind them. Then Ulza flashed a predator's grin and swore she couldn't wait to tear every single one of them apart. Ulza roared and launched herself forward, whipping the spiked club Xenon handed her through the air, and as she slammed it down on one of the last ambushers, terror flooded their eyes. Her attack slammed through with brutal force. The spiked club ripped into the ambusher, and a sickening crunch told the whole story. Another ambusher saw the brutality firsthand, then spat curses at Ulza, screaming that she was a monster as she kept hammering forward, ruthless and relentless. Rage-burning, an ambusher sprang at Ulza with a drawn sword, yelling a challenge. She swung her spiked club and caught his strike like it was nothing. The ambusher strained and shoved his sword against her club, begging her to let go, but Ulza clamped down harder, unshaken, unblinking, and refusing to budge. With a sudden surge of dark power, Ulza tore through the air in a swarm of bats, then smashed her club forward so hard the ambusher blasted back, shrieking in pure terror. She loomed over the last ambusher, shaking as he begged for his life. Then she flashed a cold smile and told him she'd wipe out every enemy of her master, and that he was the final one standing. No hesitation, she blasted her spiked club through the air like a missile, spinning it straight at the fleeing enemy, and Xenon just stared, stunned by how strong she really was. Moments later, she burst back to Xenon, grinning as she declared her mission was done. Then Xenon softly rubbed his hand over her head, lavishing praise, and she leaned into every bit of that love like it was pure comfort. With the last direct attacker finally cut down, Xenon snapped his focus to the trembling butler, who begged for his life and pleaded, "Wait!" Xenon answered coolly that his allies were gone, then asked what to do with the butler now. The desperate butler tried to save himself by claiming he was a noble from the Quran kingdom, yelling that killing him would spark a diplomatic nightmare, until Xenon snapped back that the incident was already in motion the second they struck him, a true noble of this land, then added that the butler probably meant to vanish his body and destroy the evidence, so Xenon was just going to return the favor, and the butler should have swallowed his loss at the auction in silence. Xenon just assumed he'd kill the noble, and somehow it didn't even faze him, no guilt at all. This was the first time he'd wiped out 3 people with magic, and his heart stayed icy cold. Then dark, swirling energy started pouring out of him. He wrestled with the terrifying thought that maybe he'd truly turned into Xenon Baskerville body and soul, or maybe he'd always been this way, which is why Xenon picked him in the first place. While the butler kept begging for his life and throwing money at the problem, Ulza stormed back with her club in hand and flanked Xenon, and Xenon just flashed a sinister grin and said, unfortunately for the butler, he wasn't exactly hurting for cash. Under Xenon's unspoken order, Ulza hoisted her spiked club high over her head, bracing to smash, while a terrified butler wailed, begging her to stop and wait. Her eyes flickered wider with a spark of anticipation as she blurted, "Ready, set, go." And the butler's face snapped into sheer terror, his eyes bulging the moment he understood he was about to die. With a brutal swing, he slammed his spiked club into the noble, ending his life on the spot, while Xenon watched it happen with this cold, detached stare and just muttered, "Oh my." He snapped to attention. There was no sign of anyone, not even a whisper of presence. So he blurted out Ulza's name and demanded she come back, and even as she'd already slipped away, she still spun around with a confused, questioning look. His mind was sprinting. If even he, with his powers growing every day, couldn't spot it, that was scary enough. But if Ulza, a warrior from a battle race, also missed it, then this threat wasn't just dangerous, it was terrifying. When Ulza heard his worry, she wasted no time and assured him she was fine. As Alcy swept her spiked club across the street, she demanded where their unseen enemies were hiding, and Zenon, face tight with dread, scanned the empty roads too, feeling that same cold, lingering presence. A calm, familiar voice sliced right through the chaos, telling Zenon he didn't need to be on guard, speaking to him with respect like, "Zenon Baskerville-sama." Out of nowhere, a cloaked, masked figure loomed over Zenon. He was crumpled on the cobblestones, a boot pinning his head to the ground. Then the shadowy attacker leaned in, looked him dead in the eye, and snarled, "Who the hell are you?" A masked figure in dark robes suddenly dropped in front of Zenon, and rage-filled suspicion flashed through him. Was this one of his father's men, sent to watch his every move? But the stranger cut him off, claiming they were from the Assassin Corps, sworn to Master Baskerville, and saying Lesbold personally handed them this mission. Zenon still didn't trust the name, but he snapped out a curt thanks for stepping in. Because VIPs were getting jumped on their way home after auctions, they couldn't afford to skip precautions. So a dedicated escort was always assigned to keep those prized clients safe. He kept going, saying auctions weren't just trade. They were pure spectacle, a spotlight where people could flaunt their money like it was power. And Zenon listened with his eyes widening as he watched everything unfold, even as a young woman was dragged along on a leash. Ul stood close by, gripping a brutal, spiked club, while Zenon realized in a flash just how screwed he was. Buying an expensive slave with no escort was basically waving a red flag and daring robbers to strike. But the masked figure dropped to one knee on the cracked ground and told him plainly, no escort was needed. Then they claimed the Baskerville family's future was safe in incapable hands, thanks to the successor's incredible skill. Ulza looked relieved, then he nodded and said they were heading home. While inside, he brushed off the assassin's words like nothing, refusing to let anyone try to label him as his father's replacement. The masked figure stayed on their knees and silently sent him off with a safe journey wish, then vowed to deal with the insolent fool's body, while Zenon, still frowning under the surface, walked away. The masked assassin wiped his hands after dealing with the corpse and stared ahead, craving the day he'd clash with the Baskerville Hellhound's successor again, while Zenon, with Ulza by his side, walked out of that grand building into the night sky. Later, Zenon flopped onto his bed and let out one heavy sigh, half relief, half pure exhaustion. He replayed everything in his head, 2 weeks in this world, and today he'd already made his first kill, telling himself it was necessary, feeling not a hint of regret, but then wondering. Was he just naturally ruthless, or had Zenon's mind and body crawled into him and changed the way he moves? Even after killing, he felt zero guilt, and somehow that freaked him out, because he'd been just a normal working-class Japanese guy until recently. He got why a combat race like Ulza might just kill without blinking, but he couldn't shake the fear that if he kept hesitating, he'd never make it forward. Still, no matter how messy the logic felt, one thing hit him hard. He should be relieved by the steel in his resolve. He knew that once he cleared the monsters of Dambor, sooner or later he'd have to smash through Demon King cultists, pirates, and every other ruthless criminal crawling in the shadows. A ton has happened already, but now that he's got a solid partner at his side, he finally gets to dive into the dungeon for real, no more hesitating. And when he saw he can take down enemies without second-guessing, he locks it in as a real combat strength, and man, it feels like a huge win. With Ul's power in his corner, survival suddenly looked way more possible. But he knew solo play would always slam him into a dead end, no matter how much game knowledge he had. What he really wanted was a magic user and a healer, because 2 attackers alone left his team wildly off balance. Still, he told himself the whole thing was just starting, so there was no reason to panic. Suddenly, Ulza rocketed into the room, dripping with suds and wrapped in a towel, sobbing, "Master." She staggered toward him, clutching her eyes as they burned, blaming the maid for bullying her, while Zenon froze, then slapped a hand over his mouth, and a smear of blood flashed through his fingers. A towel-wrapped female slave stormed in behind Ulza, snapping at her for darting to young Master Zenon and clinging to him like that, while Zenon, nosebleed pouring, froze in pure shock. She kept scrubbing Ulza, and he squirmed like a wild animal, soap stinging his eyes as he bucked and kicked Zenon, while Zenon, now drenched in suds too, winced with eyes burning from the sting. Even with Zenon fighting tooth and nail, she stayed cool and told him straight up, he wouldn't be able to drag Ulza away, because the Oni race was built on raw strength. Moments later, Leviana, now soaking in the bath herself, shot an inviting smile and dared the young master to join her, and Xenon's eyes went wide with pure shock. She teased him for being so mortified, and even the young master looked flustered after all this time. Then a nasty thought wouldn't let up. Did Xenon keep bathing with Leviana because there was more going on than just servitude? Later, Xenon collapsed onto his bed, groaning in pure misery. He tried to talk himself out of it, insisting he didn't actually want to bathe with Leviana. This was just a must-do to stop his real identity from leaking out. Then he tightened his fist and decided he'd get it over with, and do it fast. Later, once he'd made his call, he nodded with full confidence, and Leviana took the lead, and somehow her presence kept snapping his attention as he trailed right behind her. Soon he got shoved into the bath, and right there, Ulza gently worked the lather through his hair with those tiny hands, leaving him completely flustered by the sheer intimacy. When the bath finally ended, all three of them were submerged in warm water, bubbles drifting around them like a soft dream. Then Levi winked, flashed a thumbs up at Anna, and acted like, "Yep, that was exactly as planned." Fresh from the bath and now spotless in striped pajamas, Ulza blurted that she was going to sleep with her master. But Leviana cut in fast, saying her own bed was already being set up, and Xenon, still reeling, could only stand there and watch the whole showdown. Even with Levi doing everything he could, the compromise landed Ulz in Xenon's arms. Ulz held on tight, and Xenon just had to deal with it, while Ulz lay there awake, sighing like, "How am I ever supposed to sleep like this?" He sprawled in that lavish bed, head spinning from what happened the night before, and couldn't stop asking himself what kind of brutal ordeal this so-called new life had turned into. When morning finally broke, he replayed that unforgettable bath time in his head and swore, furiously to himself, that he'd done nothing wrong, not even so much as lifting a finger. Morning barely helped. He was still stuck in the bed with Ulza and Leviana, and the tired look on his face practically screamed, "Are we seriously doing this every single day?" He weighed every possible reaction Leviana and Ulza might throw his way if he made a move, hoping it would make everything simpler, or at least bracing for the worst that could happen. His fight inside his head wouldn't quit. He kept telling himself Ulza was just a kid. Yet that little demon girl, with a helpless look and a simple plea, reached out and asked for a hug. Ulz stood there bare as the day she was born, arms spread wide, begging for affection. So he tried to tell himself he only got her to crank up his combat power, not to cuddle some kid. Then he snapped to the real issue and demanded her age, wondering if she just didn't look. His mind sprinted in every direction, spiraling over the horrifying thought that she could be older than she looked, old enough that her flirting might not be wrong. But sleep deprivation hit like a brick wall, frying his brain as it begged him to let the momentum roll. Right then, Ulza shifted, murmured, "Master," and like nothing happened, wished him a cheerful good morning. He stared her down, nailing his first read. She was unmistakably a kid. No way she was old enough to count as anything else. Meanwhile, Leviana stirred awake, blinked herself fully conscious, turned to Xenon and asked, polite as ever, if he'd slept well. His face twisted with pure frustration, and he snapped that there was no way he'd slept well last night. He kicked off his morning with breakfast, and Leviana slid it over, swearing she'd tackle the morning chores right away. While Ulza leaned over the table, studying every bite like something big was about to happen. Right before they left, he shouted to Ulza that they were finally heading out, and reminded her of that late-night talk, how they'd decided they were going to the academy. She lit up and swore she wouldn't cause a scene or lose her temper, and that was enough to make him grin, because his plan had worked. Bringing her with him to the Royal Academy of Sword and Magic, where nobles and royals routinely show up with their own maids and attendants. That choice hit him after a brand new rule dropped. Now the school was sending kids into dungeon dives and monster hunts beyond the city walls, so he had to drag Ulza with him, because she'd be joining those dungeons right alongside him. As they stomped down the steps, he snapped that if she even sparked trouble at the academy, she'd be booted off the school grounds, no exceptions. Ulza lit up with pure excitement and vowed she'd behave perfectly just to stay by her master's side. Moments later, they rolled off in a grand carriage as the butler waved them goodbye and promised them a safe journey, and he figured that with her intentions spelled out so clearly, trouble wouldn't follow. Inside, Ulza shoved her face to the window and gaped at the scenery racing by. In the carriage, Ulza kept humming a bright little tune, her back to him as she stared out the window, while he sat across from her with his arms crossed, watching that calm joy on her face. Then she burst into song, bright and simple, about heading to school with her master while he stayed quiet, staring ahead with deep, thought-heavy silence. Ulza kept singing, and now her song rattled through all the houses they were passing, while he couldn't help but frown inside. What was that wild tune, and why did it feel like she was overflowing with happiness? As Ulza leaned on him, humming about how much fun she was having, he stared out the window with a fresh worry brewing in his chest. Was it really okay to bring her along? Ulza's eyes blazed with that innocent but terrifying kind of delight, as she sang with gleeful joy about killing and murdering, practically savoring the idea like it was pure fun. And her smile shone with unrestrained happiness even as her words turned dark. As the carriage rolled out of the Grand Academy, dread slammed into his gut, and he couldn't shake the chilling feeling that something terrible was about to hit, like doom had clung to him all night long. A grand, jewel-bright carriage rolled up to the magnificent academy, and the whole crowd instantly snapped their heads toward it. Then out stepped a blonde girl in pigtails and a dark-haired boy, and two watching students couldn't help but notice them. As the ornate carriage rumbled away and vanished down the road, the students kept staring, until one of them said it had to be from the Baskerville family, and that answer snapped another student wide-eyed with a shocked question. Inside the academy grounds, when Ulza, the little demon girl, showed up, the whole place erupted in whispers about her adorable face, her horns, and that collar around her neck, with students wondering if she was a demi-human slave. Xenon walked right beside her, and deep down he realized he'd totally misjudged how much trouble her arrival would stir up. Ulza, totally ignoring the whispers, blurted out that this had to be Master's Academy, and she couldn't hold in her excitement about tagging along. Xenon only smirked a little and told her, "You go first." But the second his smile slipped away, he snapped, asking if she even knew how to reach the classroom, telling her to stick right behind him and behave. Even with Xenon worried, Ulz marched forward with total confidence, steering Xenon and the rest of the students straight through the loud, bustling halls of the academy. As they neared the Grand Academy, the students trailing behind them started to feel uneasy, clocking Ulz's innocent face. And sensing trouble brewing, she shot them a playful grin over her shoulder, all wide-eyed charm. Ulza comes from the demi-human continent, a place the humans never reached, raised by a battle-obsessed culture. And now the real question hits hard. Can she survive the social chaos of academy life? She hummed with bright cheer, telling Xenon, "Relax, I've got this. I'll just be your attendant like I promised." But Xenon only groaned, looking sick as a dog, and when she noticed his pain, she lifted her eyes and asked, "Does your stomach hurt?" What? He softly patted her head, telling her, "I'm okay," even as his mind drifted, standing outside the Grand Academy with a crowd of students all around. Xenon snapped his head toward Ulza, eyes hard, and warned her point-blank not to do anything that would drag him into trouble. Then he made it clear she had to follow his every word, because if she did, everything would stay smooth. As they kept walking, Xenon suddenly remembered the one thing he'd failed to say, and it hit him hard. Trouble doesn't always come from you. Right then, Leon Brave, blonde and barely holding it together, snapped at Xenon with a sharp, accusatory shout, and Xenon whipped around, annoyance flashing in his eyes, while Leon warned that trouble always finds a way to show up on its own. Leon, the Danbury protagonist who screams justice with every breath, jabbed a finger at Xenon and demanded answers. Who was Ulza, and how could Xenon slap a slave collar on a kid so young? Leon snapped that he'd misread him, because he saw it plain. Xenon wasn't a villain. He was the type to gamble his life for a girl he'd only just met, not the type to look away while a little child gets treated like property. Leon kept firing off his rant. How could he not have seen Xenon was a scoundrel, when he'd literally saved their classmates in the dungeon just the other day? He even confessed he'd hoped Xenon wasn't a bad guy, but now he looked like an oblivious troublemaker who couldn't help making things worse. Xenon just clicked his tongue, and a heavy wave of irritation darkened his face at the public accusation. Xenon sat there, wrestling with the curveball fate just threw at him. Because if everything played out like the scenario, Leon would crush the Demon King and save the world, and Xenon swore to stay out of it, not touching Leon's path or messing with the story unless he tried to snatch the heroines away. He couldn't believe it. Why was Leon, this self-proclaimed protagonist, the one butting into his business and doing it right in front of everyone? Even while he admitted Ulz was just a slave, he couldn't stop thinking about what Leon was really fighting for. While Leon exploded with fury, demanding Ulz's freedom, and the poor little demon girl just stared up at him, utterly lost. Xenon, tearing his hair out at this whole mess, muttered curses under his breath as he finally realized the world had gone way off script from the games he swore he knew. As the confrontation heated up, Xenon stayed stone calm as he fired back at the packed crowd of students, Leon included, along with a blonde girl named Seal. explaining that Ulza became his slave through legit legal paperwork and a purchase approved by school rules for attendance. But Leon snapped back with furious indignation, saying no set of regulations can justify enslaving a young girl, and that it's morally vile for any human to treat another like property. Xenon watched Seal and saw the same sharp justice in her, especially when it came to women and children, just like Leon. And then she snapped, asking if he planned to grab Ulza by force if her enslavement really was unforgivable. He knew the law's tangled trap. This kingdom treated slaves like property, so bursting a captive free would count as theft or robbery. And still, Seal and Leon and the whole crowd stared in tense silence. Xenon stared at Leon and groaned. How did he always have to poke his nose into trouble, even when it meant taking the long road and burning through resources? Leon didn't even flinch at Xenon's legal threats. He just changed tactics and asked, dead serious, how much it would cost to buy Ulza and tear her out of slavery. He caught himself thinking, protagonists always act so spotless it's almost ridiculous, and maybe that's the whole point. Savor the pointless little detours just like an RPG. Xenon shut Leon down cold, refusing to sell Ulza, his precious subordinate and attendant. Even if Leon threw money at him like it meant nothing, then he waved him off and told him to get out, saying they'd catch up again later in the classroom. Fuming over Xenon's dismissal, Leon lunged ahead with his fists cocked, yelling that Xenon still didn't get it, calling him a damn idiot. Leon's punch smashed through the air straight for Xenon, but Ulza lunged in, jaw set, swearing she'd never let him lay a finger on her master. Xenon clocked the impact and knew he'd have to take the hit, because decking a helpless person in front of all those witnesses would make Leon look like the true villain. She dropped out of the sky like a bullet, tiny, furious, and brandishing a spiked club, charging straight at Leon. And in the same heartbeat, both Xenon and Leon snapped their heads up, stunned by how fast everything turned violent. Her strike slammed into the pavement with a thunderous crack, shattered the road, and sent Leon staggering back with a shocked cry, while Xenon just watched, expression cold and unreadable. She didn't hesitate. She surged forward, her tiny frame blazing with iron resolve as she swung her weapon, and with absolute certainty she promised she'd cut down anyone foolish enough to stand against her master. He tried to talk her down, begging her to calm and listen, while narrowly dodging her relentless, bone-jarring swings. Ulza kept coming, roaring battle cries like she'd decided mercy was off the table. As she slammed into her attack, Leon fought to keep himself upright, barely holding the line, while the blonde student and the others begged Ulza through desperate, shaking voices, insisting Leon wasn't her enemy at all and was only trying to rip her free from slavery's chains. Her eyes burned with stubborn resolve, and she snapped that there would be no debate about it. She kept chasing Leon without mercy, whipping her club through the air so fast the students around them scattered like startled birds, and Xenon just stared as the chaos erupted. One thought hit him hard. This is scary. He clutched his head, snapped back into reality, and felt a jolt. This wasn't the moment to drift off. As her master, he had to stop his own attendant. While she kept roaring that she'd butcher her master's enemies, he burst toward her, frantically yelling at her to stop and sit down. She stayed locked in that frenzied assault, like the world around her didn't exist, and Xenon realized the moment Ulza hit battle mode she just vanished from reality, straight up berserker instinct, or at least that's what it looked like. So he snapped out of it fast because there was no time to be amazed. He watched the panic spiral out of control, students yelling for a teacher, begging everyone to run, terrified they'd get dragged into the rampage, while Ulza, still locked in her berserker state, kept swinging and smashing anyone who dared to come near. When things went from bad to brutal, he clenched his teeth and swore he'd stop Ulza, even if it meant getting smashed himself. Leon couldn't die here, so he braced for the impact and geared up to step in no matter what. Right before he could move, Ulza erupted with a terrifying scream and hurled herself at Leon, driving a brutal kick straight into his chest, intent on crushing him for good. The hit slammed into Leon and sent him stumbling back, his eyes blown wide with shock and sharp pain as the impact tore through his body. He crumpled to the ground, convulsing and choking for breath, completely wiped out by Ul's terrifying power. His sword tossed aside nearby, like proof of how fast and vicious that beatdown was. As Ul's attack wrecked everything in sight, Xenon's face twisted into pure horror and hopeless despair, while the other students around him jerked back in terror, faces burning with shock at the violence exploding in front of them. Right as Ulza wound up to end the fallen Leon for good, Xenon finally snapped into action, throwing out his hand and roaring for her to stop. She froze for a beat, her berserker instincts scrambling at his voice, and blurted, "So, is this when we start making kids?" What? He snapped at a shocked Ulza, shouting that she was out of control, then yanked her away from the mess. While the other students kept spiraling, some yelling for a teacher and others rushing to check on unconscious Leon. With Ulz finally calm and clinging to him, Xenon was wrecked. She kept blurting out non-stop apologies, begging forgiveness for the chaos and the injuries she'd caused. The moment turned into a grim freeze frame as the other students crowded around Leon, severely injured still, and barely holding on to consciousness, leaving everyone to wonder if this was really the protagonist's final chapter. Rest in peace, Leon. Leon, two guys hauling a boy on a stretcher, while students nearby traded details about the whole incident. Leon Cohen even admitted he'd resorted to violence, but someone else snapped back that a little lady had stepped in, protected Baskerville, and hit back harder, proving she was the stronger fighter. Outside the Grand Academy, the students kept talking until they all settled on Leon Cohen as the one to blame. He'd suddenly demanded someone sell their slave to him, and that alone lit the whole crowd on fire. Every whisper turned into a scandal, as Xenon Cohen's name spread through the group. In a grand hallway, an academy official called out Zenon Kun and the Oni girl, and said the school was dropping the whole public drama to stop a nasty feud between houses. But they still made it clear. Leon Kun was in the wrong, and Zenon Kun crossed the line with his excessive force. Then the official handed Zenon the job of keeping everything calm, and Zenon immediately shot back, warning the Oni girl that if she ever went berserk again, he'd never bring her back to the academy. He even demanded the official make sure someone kept an eye on her, and the Oni girl, rubbing her head, snapped to agreement. Later, in a huge, tiered classroom, students filled every seat and leaned into their lessons, and right there in the crowd sat Xenon Cohen and the Oni girl, looking like they'd somehow slid right into school life. As Xenon Kun strode through the classroom, a spiky-haired student named John rushed up and asked if Xenon remembered him from the gargoyle incident. Then Xenon just blanked, saying he didn't recall him at all. John snapped his attention toward the Oni girl and called her Baskerville. John kept talking to Xenon Kun and the Oni girl, pointing out how brave Kun started the mess, and how Xenon had somehow survived a brutal morning, while the other students muttered like it was gossip gold, saying Leon was beloved. But that Xenon, with his resting villain stare, got dragged into everyone's hate. And on top of all that, they couldn't stop talking about how walking around with a cute little girl wearing a slave collar felt downright criminal. John then leaned in and told Xenon Kun his looks were actually pretty decent, so it left everyone wondering why he always looked so terrifying. Xenon shot him a glare and snapped, "Leave me alone, there's nothing I can do about my face." And John just winked like, "Yeah, you've already got that face whether you like it or not." He got thrust into the chaos when Alyssa, this thrilled, overly friendly student, latched onto the Oni girl and gushed that she was so cute and begged to keep her as a pet. But the Oni girl squirmed and snapped that she had to be let go, while John watched and cheered Xenon's rescue like it finally wiped out all those nasty thoughts about Xenon's bloodline. Her uneasy discomfort detonated into a full-blown surge of anger, and a vicious glow spread from her like a threat. John shot in fast, saying Alyssa just adored small animals and never meant to treat demi-humans like pets. She was only trying to be friendly. He got it, sure, but Alyssa looked completely stunned by the Oni girl's explosive reaction. He replayed the whole incident in his head, owning up to his part in it, because Leon kicked off the brawl that sparked Ul's rampage. But that didn't make her lingering grudge any less terrifying, and John's comment hit hard. A woman's grudge, really, is something formidable. Still seething, Elise kept a hold on the only girl as a teacher's voice boomed down the hallway. Class was about to start. Days dragged by, and Leon stayed gone from the academy. He missed one day, then another, and kept vanishing. His wounds were supposed to heal with magic, but the mental blow from that incident had wrecked him way deeper than anyone expected. He figured Leon would need time to bounce back, totally normal after something like that. But John cut in. It had already been a whole week, so wasn't that too long? Still, he admitted that with the annoying protagonist finally gone, he'd been able to enjoy a calm, peaceful school life. He caught her glaring at him like always, but she stayed locked in her spot, never stepping closer, never saying a word, just clutching her cup with that cold, stern look. Moments later, Alyssa strode up to the Oni girl, pressed a dish into her hands, and asked if she wanted to eat. She snapped it up without hesitation. Even more classmates jumped in, one guy and one girl included, offering her their dessert too, asking if she wanted to share theirs, and when she clutched her fork and knife, that only girl lit up with pure joy. She tore into the massive spread, especially the meat, and kept going, praising everything as so delicious. With Ul standing there, he finally noticed his harsh villain resting face had softened a little, and his classmates even started talking to him more, because apparently the only girl in the room was insanely cute. Ulzakin, the only girl, got swarmed by adoring students who fed her non-stop and praised her like she was a cute pet. Some even joked she ate like a hamster with stuffed cheeks. Then her irritation snapped through. "Don't treat me like a child." Meanwhile, the Grand Academy towered under the blazing sun, its intricate walls shining like proof of every year it had survived. Inside, Zenon Cohen sat down with his classmates, and John Cohen couldn't even fake his patience. He sighed hard, totally done. They all talked about Leon Cohen still being missing, and when John pictured the incident that left Leon possibly unable to have children, the whole thing hit him like a punch, pure trauma. John Coon kept talking, confessing he'd had the same doubts about Leon Coon's judgment, then finally snapped. Leon was an idiot for trying to steal someone else's slave, while Zenon Coon sat there locked in, sipping his drink. Then the story pivots to Leon Cohen, pure hot-blooded fire, where his justice burns so hot he snaps into action on impulse, never stopping to think about the fallout. That non-stop inner thought kept hammering. Leon Coon looked almost heroic on the page, like when he tried to save an enslaved kid, bold, charming, straight-up manga energy. But in the real world, the moment someone followed their convictions and refused to be shackled by rules, they became an absolute nightmare to handle. It hammered home one brutal truth. Real life isn't that clean, good versus evil fairytale split. It's a messy swirl of gray, and trying to force that whole mess into black and white just because a hero feels like it is pure nonsense. Back in the present, Zenon Coon shut off his thoughts and muttered that Leon Coon was just too earnest and painfully clumsy. Like, maybe the smartest move was to look away, let it slide, and go on living as a normal member of society. Over by the table, Alyssa, sweet as ever, kept sliding more food onto Ulzakin's plate, while John Coon didn't stop chewing long enough to admit this. Sure, Leon Coon might be an absolute idiot, but John never once thought he was a bad person at his core. As the meal wrapped up, Zenon Cohen caught the Oni girl grinning with a full belly, surrounded by a mountain of empty dishes, and she bragged about just how much she'd eaten. Then his thoughts snapped to the bigger war ahead, sharing the same burning wish. If they're going to beat the Demon King, they'll need a day when they can finally understand each other. He watched the only girl everyone had finally started to adore, and in one classroom she swept the whole room with effortless charm, right there, where she used to be all alone. A few moments later, he headed down a bright, sunlit hallway, and the only girl zipped ahead of him, a blur of motion that looked totally free of all the heavy thoughts that usually tangled his mind. Right then, something outside the window caught his eye. A small group of students had clustered together, and two male students were earnestly trying to convince a blonde girl to join them. Leon Quinn, the wavy blonde-haired guy, boldly claimed they'd take the front line, and said Aith Centria, the blonde girl, would handle healing, swearing she'd never regret joining their party. He even pitched a one-quest trial run, but Aith hesitated, because the idea of teaming up with a party full of guys felt weirdly awkward to her. As Zenon Cohen kept watching, he clocked the blonde student, Aith Centria, the saint of Centria and an absolute top-tier healer, and he immediately knew this was the kind of party recruitment night that changes everything, like a classic scene playing out right in front of him. The only girl beside him was bouncing with curiosity too, practically begging him to tell her what he was staring at. He stared at the scene and swore he'd seen it before, like the future was flashing in his eyes. This was the moment, the warning that Aith was about to step into Leon Cohen's party. Then, right in the middle of everything, a hand shot out and cut the conversation short. Leon Cohen shot her a determined look and announced that Centria had already agreed to join his party. Then he clamped onto her hand and practically pulled her in. Aith Centria started out stunned, but Leon Cohen's bold courage hit her fast, and you could see respect click into place. So her affection turned on like a switch, all to lock in her future as a standout heroine. From the window, Zenon Cohen kept staring, and then a soft gasp slipped out as the whole game event unfolded right in front of him, like fate putting on a show. It hit him hard that this was a turning point, and the Oni girl stayed right there watching the chaos with him. With him, suddenly, one girl plowed into his back from behind. He jerked around, startled out of his skin, and blurted out a shocked scream. Before he could even finish his thoughts, Ulzakin, the only girl, slammed into him and knocked him off balance, her tiny body catching him by surprise. He stumbled, shot her a grimace, winced like it hurt, and muttered through the pain while she looked up and begged him not to stop so suddenly. Meanwhile, across the way, Aith Centria's eyes snapped wide with dread, and a cold truth hit her hard. Leon Cohen, the one she just teamed up with, wasn't there today. Even from a distance, the sight of him sitting alone, slumped and dejected, screamed just how serious everything had become. As word of Leon Kuhn's absence hit, tension snapped into the room and other students. Yeah, even the boy and girl from their class, crowded around Aith, panicked and whispering, "What happens with the event coming up, and will she be okay without the hero there?" Right beside them, Zenon Kuhn just watched, and the question of what he was supposed to do next felt heavier with every second. Outside the academy gates, Aith Centria stood shoulder to shoulder with Leon and a blonde male student, and the blonde kid was pressing his pitch to her, right there in the open. He told them his father was a count, best buddies with Aith's dad, Viscount Centria, and begged them to at least try to get along. Just once, while Leon, lurking at a distance, listened like every word mattered. Aith thought for a beat, then nodded and told him, if it was just temporary, she'd come with him. The male student lit up and promised they'd head to the dungeon after school and start the briefing, but as she stood there, sadness shadowed her, and her eyes wouldn't stop drifting downward. Meanwhile, Leon stayed locked inside, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next, and then it hit him. Aith was a noble too. He didn't think they were aiming at her outright, but their real motives were so obvious it stung, and he couldn't help cursing fate for this brutal twist. The heroine getting dragged off by some random mob nobody. Meanwhile, the other students huddled together and whispered about what was happening, and they couldn't even force a laugh while Leon spiraled into misery. They said Aith won't join his party like this, and Leon was just digging his way deeper into ruin. Crushed by despair, Leon dropped to the floor, praying this mess wouldn't turn into something even worse. As the chaos erupted, Zenon strode down the hallway, fingers raking through his hair while worry gnawed at his face, and behind him the small girl trailed in total silence. In a loud classroom, John, always full of energy, leaned over during free period and asked Alyssa if she wanted to hit the sage's playground, because he had to train. Alyssa lit up and said yes, while other students lingered in the background, some perched on the tiered benches, others chatting and standing around. From a distance, Zenon watched as Aith Centria stood before male student 3 and Leon, male student 3 talking fast and wild, while Leon hung beside them with a face that screamed pure despair, like her decision had slammed the weight of the world onto his chest. Male student 3 kept talking, dead confident that once Aith, the healer, joined their party, the Cave King's bedchamber would be a complete walk in the park. Zenon shut that down fast, saying the dungeon was basically beginner turf, packed with rock-type monsters like golems, and sure their recruiting was pushy, but it still didn't violate any rules, while he just scoffed internally, annoyed to the bone. With annoyance gnawing at him, Zenon snapped that fretting non-stop was pointless, then decided to head straight into a dungeon, because sitting around was killing his mood, and nothing beat a little hunting to get his spirits back up. Moments later, Girl 1 shot him an eager look and blurted, "So where are we heading next?" Zenon thought about heading to the sage's training grounds, but the moment that sharp girl sensed everything, she challenged him, like, "Aren't you going after the girl from before?" He shut it down instantly and snapped, "Why would I do that?" She wouldn't let it go. She stared him down and said his face screamed that he was about to chase after her. Then she bluntly asked if he was worried about Aith. Zenon froze, stammered out a half-admission, said maybe that's true, but he couldn't finish his sentence. Only the girl watching closely clocked it. Sure, he acted like he didn't care, but he cared way more than she thought. She warned him, "If you're really going after Aith, we'd better hurry." And Zenon shot back, pulling her along. "I never said I was going after her, and nothing's guaranteed to happen." He kept talking to himself, calling out how that other student's pitch to recruit Aith was pushy, and all too eager to flash their noble titles, talk about a classless move, then admitted that plenty of students pulled the same kind of power harassment. Still, he brushed off the risk, insisting the Cave King's bed chamber wasn't some unbeatable nightmare, and unless their luck was brutally awful, they wouldn't even need him. Zenon was sure he didn't belong anywhere near this. No way, not with him playing the villain. Because if someone was going to save the main heroine, it had to be Leon, not him. Or he'd end up rescuing Aith and accidentally hit a flag that would flip him into a heroine-stealing protagonist. And while Zenon wrestled with that fear, Leon just stood there with a determined glare, ready to take on whatever was coming next. Even with Zenon shaking his head and trying to justify it in his own mind, his face stayed heavy with worry, like a storm he couldn't hide. Girl 1 caught it instantly, looked up at him, and asked with real concern why he was wearing that troubled expression. He was stuck in a brutal inner war, desperately trying to save Aith, but convinced he couldn't choose it at all, because the trauma from Damburu II was still choking him. where Xenon's messed-up role-playing pushed Aerith to push Leon, and Leon, once her biggest fan, brought the Demon King back just to spite her. He wished he could just shrug it off and pretend he'd seen nothing, telling himself he was too tangled in it to mess with Leon's path. At the same time, the Oni girl watched him like a hawk, realizing she still didn't truly get what her master was fighting inside. Then an Oni proverb snapped in her thoughts. If an Oni is troubled, they should bite into it first. He demanded what a line like that even meant, and she said it straight. Wipe your enemies out first, then deal with the rest later. So stop spiraling, beat your foes to death, and if your mind just won't shut up, go find someone and punch them instead. Xenon snorted with equal parts frustration and laughter, calling it a total muscle-brain stunt. Mind-bogglingly dumb, yet weirdly refreshing. He erupted into laughter, calling the battle-crazed race's motto ridiculous, yet weirdly effective at making all worry feel completely pointless, and he couldn't help but think they were just too stupid to overthink it. He admitted, yeah, being an idiot once in a while won't kill him, especially since Leon was already stuck in bed, and he was done spinning worst-case scenarios and overthinking every red flag. Maybe he should follow Oni girl_1's lead and copy Leon's courage, then just go with what he felt. So he softly patted her head and she lit up like, yes, master. He decided that if his help somehow hurt things, he'd be the one who took the fall, no excuses. He didn't even know what rescuing the heroine would do to the timeline, but he was going to steal her away anyway. And when he thought about Leon's past disasters, getting kicked, missing the flag, dropping out of school, he made it his own fault in his head. So now he couldn't stand the idea that he was just sitting there overthinking it. With fresh resolve blazing in him, he and Oni, girl_1, strode out of the Grand Academy like they owned the place, declaring that no matter what fate throws at them, he'll keep playing the villain, rescue whoever he chooses, and crush anyone he doesn't. While Oni beside him cheered, simple as best. He shot a decisive thumbs up and yelled, let's go. Oni girl_1 lit up like a firework and declared, yeah, that's Ul's master. Then both of them launched into the air, instantly vanishing from the academy grounds in a blur. Their quest dragged them into a hushed town, and then, boom, they finally hit the ominous mouth of a dark cave where a swarm of glowing eyes stared back from the shadows. Deep in the cave, he barked, all right, let's go. The Oni girl snapped up, yes, master. He pointed them straight to the cave king's bedchamber, and a cruel grin tore across his face as a towering golem monster erupted in front of them, ready to smash into the fight. He watched as Oni, girl_1, clenched her jaw and slammed her spiked club into the golem, cracking its rocky body apart in a brutal hit, and the thing screamed as it got completely crushed. She tore across the battlefield like a fury-fueled blur, smashing rock-type monsters one after another until they crumbled into rubble, while her mind screamed the same brutal goal: destroy, slaughter, and end them all. Her face lit up with pure pride as she bragged to her master about her win, and he nodded like, yeah, you really crushed it. Then he leaned in and warned her, the dungeon drops 10 floors, and every step down means nastier monsters, so stay sharp. And deep in his head, he couldn't help thinking her strength was exactly what he'd expect from someone strong enough to beat Leon to a pulp. As they plunged deeper into the cave king's bedchamber, Xenon realized they were still nowhere near Aerith's party, and only girl_1's weapons shredded the rock-type monsters down here. Her brutal style was hitting like a wrecking ball. Suddenly, a giant stone bear, built from jagged rock and sparkling crystals, crashed out of the shadows, and Oni gasped when she realized what it was, while Xenon just calmly named it a stone bear, calling out its brutal strength like it was nothing. Oni, no hesitation, hurled herself at the stone bear and slammed it so hard chunks of its rocky body cracked apart. She bellowed for it to break open, and Xenon had his sword up with a magic spell ready to finish the job. But when the smoke cleared, the bear vanished from his immediate view. Ulzakin let out a fierce battle cry and drove a brutal blow straight through the defeated stone bear monster, smashing it into glittering fragments, while Xenon-kun stared at the wreckage with a faint, uneasy concern. After that lightning-fast win, Xenon-kun realized he hadn't faced real trouble since the gargoyle, barely even had time to get warmed up. Meanwhile, Ulzakin just lit up with pride and let out a long, satisfied sigh. He snapped his gaze to Ulzakin, went deadly serious, and told her to hold back in the next fight, waiting for his signal, because he wouldn't let her throw herself into danger. Then she blurted out a shocked little gasp. He repeated himself, hammering the message as a command. No arguing, no objections. Ulzakin, crushed and dejected, only managed a tiny, defeated sound back. Out of the shadows, a bigger stone bear monster lunged into view, menacing as it could be. While Xenon-kun's voice sliced through the air, demanding to know if she really thought he was too weak to handle anything without her shielding him. When the monster lunged, Zenon-kun darted aside in a heartbeat, power rushing past him and a smug smirk spread across his face, because its strike hit exactly when he'd predicted. The stone bear roared, furious and helpless. He snapped up his blade to meet the beast's next strike head-on, parrying it like it was nothing, and with a sharp grin in his eyes, he bragged that he still had its attack pattern burned into his mind. He leaned in and studied the stone bear's every move, spotting the exact motion it flashed right before it launched its charging attack. With a ferocious roar, the monstrous thing lunged. Then he snapped backward, slipping out of the path of its brutal jaws. With a lightning-fast leap and a slick acrobatic twist, he hurled himself over the beast and slammed it so hard its rocky body split apart into a spray of fragments, while its head collapsed into dust. He touched down like a dancer, sword still blazing forward, and ripped out a fierce cry as the last of the monster faded into nothing around him. With the danger crushed, he slid his blade back into its sheath, and the monster's wreckage clattered down, totally harmless. Ulza-chan peeked out from behind that big rock, let out a huge breath of relief and praised him for his strength, then declared he was finally worthy to be her master. After that, she turned to him and asked, "Are you okay?" He smirked to himself, thinking, "Yeah, I'm not great at this stuff, but I know the game's mechanics, so I can take down a mid-level monster on my own, no magic needed." He was sure that if he kept pushing, even tougher foes would level him up fast enough to clear the dungeon in a snap. And when Ulzakin caught his thoughts, she teased that his self-rating sounded a little sarcastic, but she didn't really mind. Still, he didn't let her get cocky. He warned her that the dungeon could bite at any moment, and that with their current strength, they might not be ready to clear it. Deeper into the cavern they went, and Ulzakin thrust a tiny glowing orb forward, eyes blazing with thrill, while he stared down at a matching orb in his own hand. Their trail dumped them into a sprawling, ancient cave system, its ceiling dripping with endless stalactites, until it revealed the cave king's bedchamber waiting up on the 8th floor. He scanned the dungeon's dim halls, barely able to see a thing, and told Ulzakin to stay locked in. She answered instantly, swinging her spiked club and swearing she'd butcher every monster that stepped out. A second later, boom, sound and debris exploded as Ulzakin lunged in, exactly like she promised, and smashed a monster with one savage, power-packed strike. He stared in shock, surprised, but also a little worried at how ferociously she came at it. The road ahead yawned open into a massive, shadowy cavern, its jagged entrance swallowing the light and daring him to face whatever horrors waited inside. Right then, when they got close, 3 terrified students came spilling out of the cave. Leon Cohen, John, Juan, and one more guy, all of them scrambling and screaming that a monster was loose, and Leon shot his arm out, barking for them to stop. Even after his order, those students kept bolting, so he snapped out a shadowbind spell, and dark tendrils burst from the ground to grab all 3, pinning them helpless in midair as dust and debris exploded around them. With the students pinned in place, he barreled straight into John and demanded answers. Why they'd been running, and most of all, where Aith Centria was. Even trapped, the students kept panicking. They swore a monster way stronger than they expected had slammed them, forcing them to leave Aith behind and run for their lives. He heard it out, but his face went cold and dismissive with a sharp TCH. A student begged him to let them go, but he snapped coldly, saying it wasn't his problem and calling them morons. Then he spun to Ulzakin and ordered, "We're continuing right now." As he and Ulzakin slipped away, he couldn't stop thinking. He'd already mowed down most of the monsters in this stretch. Then his mind snapped to the bound students. If fate smiled, they'd stay untouched until his binding magic fizzled out. But if luck ran out, some monster would come crashing for them first. He kept marching, brushing off the idea of fate as he judged anyone who would leave their companions behind. And then his steps snagged when something up ahead caught his eye, widening his vision with shock. A colossal, glittering mithril monster rose from the depths, its entire body made of shimmering metal, radiating pure dread as it stomped into view. This gigant mithril was a truly terrifying enemy. Meanwhile, Aith Centria, now hiding in a nun's habit, scrambled to hold a thin barrier together as the monster slammed into it, crack by crack, until it started to fail. Seeing the thing clearly, Zenon-kun instantly knew it was a dark blade, one of the deadliest variants. He snapped at Ulzakin to buy them time. Only dodging, don't push it, and she obeyed on instinct, instantly luring the monster with a sharp cry, while Aith Centria, hurt and sprawled on the ground, blinked up in shock as she recognized Ulzakin as Baskerville Sama. Zenon Cohen snapped his gaze to Aith Centria, frustration and pure disbelief crashing across his face, because she hadn't changed one bit from the game, and while she kept begging him to flee, she swore he couldn't possibly beat the monster. She was convinced her life had one purpose: sacrifice herself for others, always rushing in to help the ones in trouble, even when it could cost her everything. Aith Centria kept pushing him away, swearing her sacrifice would let him and Ulzakan get out, when Zenon-kun suddenly stepped up, asking if she was okay, his worry blazing through her stubborn refusal. Then he shoved a drink into her mouth and bulldozed past her protests. She thanked him every week, yet kept insisting he run and swore she'd buy him time. Zenon-kun, though, raged at her relentless self-sacrifice. His thoughts were a storm of rage. Her stubborn refusal was finally pushing him over the edge, so he decided he'd lay into her and make her hear every last word. Zenon-kun burst out, yelling at her, slamming her as an idiot, and demanding who on earth would ever listen. Then he swore he'd force her to beg, "Please, save me." And not just any way, but the exact way Aith had meant it. With that monstrous golem still slamming into everything, Aith sobbed openly, tears pouring down her cheeks as she begged Zenon, saying that if they kept going like this, he and the only girl would get wiped out too. She begged them to stop sacrificing themselves for someone like her, but Zenon snapped with clenched fists, frustrated and furious, pressing her hard for what she really meant by someone like. Aith stared at the ground, choking on words, only squeezing out a shaky sound. When Zenon shot her voice upward and snapped that her self-esteem was so crushed it made her seem like she thought her own life meant nothing at all. Aretha's self-sacrificing soul didn't come from thin air. When she was just a kid, bandits ambushed her and her mother, and the trauma never let her go. To keep her daughter safe, Aretha's mother bravely slammed up a magical barrier. But every second of it guzzled her mana, battering her strength until she started to crumble. Even under the crushing pain, Aith clenched her teeth and pressed on, swearing she'd keep that barrier up no matter what it cost her. Because if it dropped, those bandits would come for her and kill her for sure. Aith's mom tried to fight through sheer will, but her body finally gave out, life draining away as the barrier sputtered and died. Then the bandits, spooked by the guards rushing in, barked for everyone to stay put, only to realize they wouldn't be able to stop escaping, so they bolted too. Young Aith screamed for her mother, but the moment was gone. She'd survived only because her mother didn't, and that loss crushed her into thinking her own life didn't matter anymore, like she'd gladly burn herself for anyone else. Meanwhile, Zenon watched her tear herself down and seethed at what she'd turned into, furious that someone could throw their life away when happiness was literally within reach. He kept the pressure on, snapping that Aith needed to stop brushing herself off. She tried to defend it, saying she was just doing her duty as God's servant, but he found every word of it infuriatingly annoying. Then he slammed her with the truth about her father and mother, who died for her, insisting that if she denied her own value, she was basically spitting in the face of everyone who loved her. And he demanded she finally see the one thing she couldn't seem to understand. Then it hit him. Those brutal words were meant for Leon, but Leon wasn't there, so he had to spit them out himself. Aith, drowning in emotion, could only choke out a small gasp as her face twisted with pure distress. In the blink of a memory, or the sheer force of his will, Zenon snapped, locked in, and swore he'd crush every miserable turn that tried to break him. He refused to watch the heroine die just to save someone else, and he wouldn't let her suffer a single day in this new life he'd been handed. For her, he'd become whatever this world demanded, hero or villain, no matter what it took. His lecture kept roaring louder and louder. Then he snapped that she was nothing but arrogant, a loser who couldn't even satisfy herself but still acted like she could make everyone else happy. He hammered in that her life belonged to her alone, and there was no reason to throw it away just to serve other people. Then he pointed at her and demanded she stop acting so full of herself. He kept pushing and told her a weakling is supposed to cling, cry ugly, and beg for saving. Then he slammed her with the truth. She had things she wanted, hobbies she loved, and she needed to say it out loud if she didn't want to die. Behind them, a golem kept getting battered, attacked by forces no one could see. Aith's eyes brimmed with tears, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked. She demanded to know if someone like her, who lived on the price of her mother's life, had the right to ask for help. He leaned in close with a hard stare and snapped, "Moron," then said asking for help is for the weak. Because she was weaker than him, she'd better rush, bow her head, and beg him to save her. Tears poured down her cheeks as Aith clutched her hands together, pleading with all her heart, begging him to save her. He watched her with a sly smirk, thinking it was wild how gorgeous she still looked while she cried, and then the thought hit, asterisk should he share in that beauty. But he shut it down fast like a warning flag just went off and decided it wouldn't get under his skin. He snapped his focus to the huge golem. While everyone else's attacks bounced off, it stayed completely unhurt, and he barked at Aerith to chug a mana potion, swearing it would refill her mana. He told her she didn't get to say no, and that he'd bring that monster down. Then he leaned in and made it crystal clear. She wasn't supposed to lump him with cowards who bolt and leave a woman behind, because he had a real plan. He watched Ulza grit through agony as a huge, spiked weapon slammed into her, her face twisting in pain, while even the Oni's brutal club couldn't scratch the terrifying enemy. That gigant mithril creature was brutally tough, exactly like the game promised. Nothing you'd ever stumble on by accident, a truly rare beast. In Danbury, people whispered a brutal truth. There's no such thing as a truly safe dungeon. No matter how normal it looks, nothing ever stays 100% secure. The game even plants surprises on purpose, and those terrifying encounter monsters hit with terrifying power way above the dungeon's usual level, showing up with a tiny 0.1% chance. Each of them carried skills that could wipe you out the second you met them head-on. So Xenon snapped his focus to the nun and ordered her to heal Ulza, the demi-human right beside them, while he started chanting a magic spell. The nun shot back that she was terrified magic wouldn't even scratch something like that. He scoffed at her doubt, claiming he knew these rare, deadly monster species inside out. Then the proof hit hard when his blade caught even a single drop of blood, revealing its own wild mithril-fused properties. He told her mithril was magic-proof, so every attack just bounced right off and did 0 damage. Then he snapped, "Follow me, do the job you were assigned." Even with doubts clawing at her at first, the nun gave in and dropped to her knees, starting her chant. She roared out powerful buffs: exhale, strength up, stamina charge, and rabbit's foot, and the magic energy spun around her staff like a living storm. Just seconds later, power surged through Ulza like lightning. Her wounds snapped shut before her eyes, and she roared that she was still in this and ready to fight. Xenon leaned in toward the kneeling nun and told her the truth. Her real power wasn't playing shield for everyone else. It was healing and backing them up. So he demanded to know why she'd try to crush the gift she was born with. Still, the nun's face crumpled with worry as she insisted, "Even so, I won't let anyone get hurt." Xenon caught the nun's protective instincts and calmly told her, "Standing at the front to shield everyone is the vanguard's duty, while a healer's only job is to patch up whoever gets hurt." He stared down the massive golem and instantly knew this was hopeless. Both his punches and spells barely scratched it, and a death on the spot like this felt completely insane. But that fierce spark in his eyes lit up and he slammed out, "All right, let's move." Xenon stared at the game mechanics, remembering every time his low skill proficiencies had blown up his plans. He knew the whole system, Dambori, didn't care about levels, it ran on skill proficiency. New magic came only from magic tomes. You grabbed the book, learned the spell, then ground your proficiency until you could actually cast it. And now, he was about to fire off a spell he absolutely shouldn't be able to cast at his current level. He kept rolling the idea around in his head. Yeah, even with lousy skills, you can still study brutal spells from magic tomes, but nothing fires unless your ability is high enough. And that messy catch is exactly what hooked him. So with a shaky kind of confidence, he asked, "Should we start?" Because he'd figured out 2 different ways to take down the gigant mithril. He said the first method was pure brute force. Keep slipping past every enemy hit, then hammer them relentlessly until their durability finally shatters. While around the giant, lifeless golem, the other students lay sprawled out, knocked out cold. Xenon laid it out. The real alternative wasn't clever tricks, it was magic itself. He swore the old myth was wrong, saying mithril doesn't just nullify spells. Instead, if those mithril armors get blasted past a set damage line, they crack and fall apart, turning a terrifying enemy into a normal target. Xenon shot a determined look, then pulled out a tiny dark bottle, info he'd clawed from a brutal challenge and passed around by players on walkthrough sites, because this doping item was pure pay-to-win. Ulza and the nun stared with wide, shocked eyes as Xenon grinned and told them the doping bottle could jack up his skill proficiencies for a short time. Then he popped it, and a swirling vortex of dark energy blasted from his hand, screaming that his skills had hit max. Now charged with power, Xenon snapped at Ulza to back off, because he'd just unlocked the highest tier of dark magic, and right in front of them, a massive, swirling spell construct started to take shape. Then Xenon erupted with raw power, slamming out the spell called ******, declaring that only the Demon King and he could wield an incantation that brutal. The golem just stood there, bracing for the dark magic to tear it apart. The gigant mithril golem, trapped in the terrifying grip of that biscuit, bellowed a guttural scream as dark magic ripped through its body, and raw power blazed out like a storm. That mithril armor, once branded unbreakable, started to split and crumble, chips breaking off as a killer force chewed it from the inside, until the empty void underneath stared back. The golem's towering body crumbled into a raging vortex of dark particles, vanishing without a trace. Only shimmering dust lingered behind, screaming just how unstoppable that spell really was. With the threat finally crushed, Xenon let out a shaky breath, every last weary sound slipping out of him as his hand still trembled from the effort, while Ulza practically bounced out of her skin, screaming, "We did it!" Like it was no surprise at all, exactly what I'd expect from my master. While Aith stared at Xenon, it hit her hard. A thought raced through her mind. Is he the one her mother warned about, the fated person she's meant to give everything to? Ulza was still buzzing with joy, so she lunged at Xenon and latched onto him tight, hard enough to make him grimace and shout for her to let go, because his whole body was screaming from the rebound effects of that doping bottle, while Aith watched in silence, cheeks heating up as a blush spread across her face. She tried to speak, then a tiny, broken plea slipped out of her lips, only to fizzle the moment she stared at Xenon, who was sitting there, writhing in the aftershock of that lingering pain. A cold, cavernous void yawned in front of them. Jagged walls, a ruined floor, piles of debris and tossed odds and ends, like either nature carved it that way or something brutal just happened here. Down in the watery depths, the witch ruled with a simple trade. Drop off the metals you've hauled in, and she'll swap them for rare goodies, and Xenon, clutching one of those metals, couldn't help but think it was basically a game system. The metal wasn't just currency, it was proof you survived some nasty danger. As they pushed deeper through the cavern, Xenon suddenly told her it was time to turn back, and the demon girl slipped alongside him in total silence while their footsteps whispered off the stone walls. Suddenly, a brutal whirlwind tore open the air, trapping two students in its violent spiral. Xenon, Sister Lily, and the demon girl watched in shock as the students screamed the name, Baskerville, and Xenon blurted out a startled gasp. Tossed around by the whipping winds, the students yelled at Baskerville to break the spell and free them, swearing the pain was unbearable. Watching it all, Xenon wondered if the real monsters had never chased them, then decided, coldly, that he should just walk away and let fate handle the rest, until Sister Lily stepped in and said she'd volunteered as the decoy, which was why the students had been split off from them. She insisted it made no sense to blame them now, and Xenon, thrown off for a second, caught himself wondering if she'd just used his first name, like she'd been waiting to do it. Sister Lily kept pushing her point, saying the academy had to deal with the punishments, and a student's moral compass wasn't permission for vigilante payback. While Xenon, eyes sharp and stern, admitted she had a point but still drove home the same truth. They'd left a party member behind. She pleaded with him to stop dragging his reputation down, insisting he didn't need to sully his own hands messing with people like that. Sister Lily's heartfelt plea hit Xenon like thunder. He weighed the brutal fallout of leaving those trapped students behind, knew the whole academy would brand him a traitor, and feared even the friends he'd just made would turn their backs on him, because no matter how they got into this mess, abandoning them to become monster bait was a line he couldn't cross. While he wrestled with the thought, the whirlwind roared louder and the trapped students screamed in pure terror. Xenon snapped his fingers and shut down the idea of being a saintess like Sister Lily claimed, but he still had to admit, mercy was exactly the kind of thing that girl did, even to people who'd given up hope. Meanwhile, Ulza, another demon girl with pure, playful fire, kept admiring her striped satchel like it was a treasure, then grinned and blurted that she was bored and ready to smash enemies, no waiting, just action. Back with Xenon and Sister Lily, he finally caved, and with a lazy wave of his hand, he agreed to her plea. Sister Lily's cheeks were blazing as she leaned into Xenon and spelled out the truth. She wasn't chasing a rescue for the students at all. She was fighting to protect Xenon's honor, the man who saved her. Right there, Ulza kept humming with pure excitement, completely missing the deeper meaning in every word. A tense hush settled between Sister Lily and Xenon as they stared each other down in the cavern, like the truth clicked into place for both of them at once. Elsewhere, Ulza, grinning with a cheerful was already snatching up crystals and other goodies off the ground because he'd just wiped out a giant, monstrous beast, and its wrecked remains were still right there. Xenon clocked Ulza's cheeky comeback to his earlier order and snapped, "When did you start playing my protector?" Sister Lily watched him, worry etched on her face, and then Xenon barked at Ulza to come back. Ulza shot back with a thunderous, "Yes, master," and bolted down the road toward Xenon and Sister Lily. When she came back, Ulza practically burst with pride, thrusting her satchel at Xenon, crystals and goodies piled inside, shouting that she'd snagged a ton of items. After finishing her task, Ulza lights up like the happiest person alive as Xenon ruffles her hair and praises her hard work, while Sister Lily watches the whole moment with a warm, gentle smile. Then the crew charges back up that dark, stone-carved path, cutting loose from the dungeon's depths behind them. As they walk, Ulza grabs tight onto Xenon's arm, cheek pressed against him, while Sister Lily keeps right beside them. Sister Lily crawls right up to Xenon, pressing her body into his side and making discomfort hit him like a sudden jolt. Xenon's face twists into a silent scream, pure panic flooding him as the sudden closeness hits way harder than he ever expected. He starts protesting in his head, hyper-aware of Sister Lily's gentle chest pressed against his arm, then tries to offer a polite request for her to give him a little more space as they walk. Sister Lily cuts off his idea, and in her healer voice, she says she'll be the one in trouble if she isn't protected when the time hits, so staying close makes sense. Then she twists the knife by reminding him that he's the one who told her to do as she pleases, and Xenon can't help but stew with the fear that he might end up being accused of molestation. Xenon, still reeling, realizes Sister Lily is putting the blame right back on him. She swears she's only doing what he told her to do, while his mind spirals because the romance signals are already blazing, and even though she's not in some official party, he feels like he just dragged her into something she didn't ask for. Sister Lily snaps the conversation in a new direction and asks Xenon if they can talk, then spills her heart. Her mother's last words, the promise of a fated partner, the command to give her everything and never leave his side because he would become her hero. And now she's staring at Xenon, wondering if he's the very hero she's been waiting for. Xenon, totally rattled by her words, blurts in his head that he's no hero, and that Aith's last thoughts were a wild misunderstanding, panicking to make her understand. He's meant to be the enemy. The witch from the watery depths kept her cryptic advice coming, watching him like she already knew his fate, telling him his own choices would decide whether he'd become a hero or a villain, and insisting that maybe, just maybe, he'd turn toward the light, but her calm voice still dripped with a brutal warning. Someone is hunting the hero, and they'll drag the world into ruin. He was way too flustered with Sister Lily standing so close and blurting out all that stuff to actually absorb the witch's big advice. So he snapped questions back, grilling her on when she started playing fortune teller, and insisting he never asked for life advice in the first place. As he spoke, her hand brushed his arm, and her eyes locked onto his with fierce devotion that made his heart slam in his chest. Her grip tightened just a notch. Then panic slammed into him because the force of her feelings hit way harder than he ever expected. She kept pouring out her heartfelt vows, swearing he was the one she was born to serve, her destiny, her true person. "If you rise as a hero," she promised, "I'll become a saintess or even a guardian angel to shield you." And if he stayed an ordinary man, she wouldn't flinch. She'd devote her whole life to him, as only an ordinary woman could, pledging to stand by his side through sickness and health, forever, no matter what. Those blazing declarations hit him like a shock, words that never existed in the game he knew. Heat rushed to his face, his thoughts sprinted wild, and he frantically tried to steady himself, telling his mind to stop staring as Sister Lily and Ulza Clungton hung there, right in front of him. His internal battle raged harder and harder, sweat pouring down his brow as he realized this twist was way bigger than he could ever handle. Moments later, while they pushed deeper through that dark, twisting cavern, Ulza started rubbing her eyes and yawned she was beat. So Xenon, clocking her exhaustion, immediately offered to shoulder her on his back. He scooped her up onto his shoulders, but the extra weight instantly made every step a struggle. Then Sister Lily shot in right away, supportive as ever, promising to bear the load so he could stop worrying. Side by side, they pushed on and finally climbed a towering staircase toward a blinding light, the moment that screamed, "Another dungeon cleared." He burst out of the dungeon, and the exit's bright light nearly blinded him. Then, from right behind him, a small, sleepy voice mumbled, "I'm hungry." Still balancing the drowsy girl on his shoulders, he trudged along with Sister Lily, and she beamed softly like she was cheering every step. His resolve turned to steel. No way he'd ever become someone's pawn or get betrayed. He refused the script, stormed ahead his own way, and swore the world wouldn't fall apart on his watch. He grinned, confident light flashing in his eyes as he looked back on everything that brought him here. Ulza was right by his side, and somehow he'd even found friends. But now there was one more person waiting. Now his sidekick wasn't just anybody, it was Aith Centria, one of the three main heroines right there with him. Morning light burst over the city, and birds tore across the sky like a drum roll for a brand new day. The grand gates of that towering mansion hung wide open, and two silent guards stood there like stone, watching everything. He shoved onward through the road ahead, Ulza clinging to his leg like glue, while Sister Lily stayed right by his side. Because after he got reincarnated as the villain, this was the path he'd fully decided to embrace. The huge city square opened up in front of them, roaring like proof of the world he was building. And as the villain, his real path had only just begun.